When the Great Crusade was young and the galaxy burned with the promise of human unity, long before the eternal stalemate of the 41st millennium consumed all hope, the Iron Warriors Legion emerged from the crucible of Terra as masters of siege warfare. Their origins remain shrouded in mystery even to the most learned Magos Biologus of the Adeptus Mechanicus. But what fragments of knowledge survive paint a picture of warriors who achieved mastery over fortress breaking when the Emperor himself walked among men. In the dying light of the 42nd millennium, as the Imperium faces threats that would have broken lesser civilizations 10,000 times over, scholars of the Ordo Hereticus still debate the true nature of what transpired on the world-designated Sebastus IV. The official records, such as they survive, speak of a tactical engagement between loyalist and traitor forces. The reality, hidden beneath layers of classification and deliberate obscuration, tells a far more disturbing tale of two legions that chose mutual annihilation over the shame of defeat. Compared to the desperate, grinding warfare of the current age, the Iron Warriors arose during an epoch when the Imperium still possessed the technological mastery to craft weapons capable of cracking worlds. Their gene seed, drawn from the IV Primarch Perturabo, contained perhaps 3 times more computational capability than standard Astartes patterns, allowing them to calculate siege trajectories and structural weaknesses with mathematical precision that bordered on the supernatural. The cosmic environment differed dramatically from today's warp-torn hellscape. This was an age when science and reason still held sway over superstition and desperate faith. Archaeological evidence places the Iron Warriors' first documented fortress-breaking operations somewhere between M30.750 and M30.850, during the middle phases of the Great Crusade. What made them unique among the Emperor's legions was not just their tactical expertise, but their psychological makeup. They were warriors who found beauty in destruction, who saw the collapse of enemy fortifications as a form of art. Where other legions fought for glory or conquest, the Iron Warriors fought to prove the mathematical inevitability of their methods. But beneath their mechanical precision lay a bitterness that would consume not just the legion, but their most hated rivals. The Imperial Fists, Zevan Legion, stood as the perfect mirror to Perturabo's sons. Where the Iron Warriors excelled at breaking fortresses, the Imperial Fists specialized in building them. Their Primarch, Rogal Dorn, possessed an intuitive understanding of defensive architecture that allowed him to create strongholds that had never fallen to enemy assault. This fundamental opposition, the unstoppable force against the immovable object, created a philosophical tension that would eventually tear both legions apart. What the official histories fail to acknowledge is the personal animosity that developed between Perturabo and Dorn during the Great Crusade. Both Primarchs were perfectionists by nature, driven by an obsessive need to prove their methods superior. When Imperial forces encountered enemy fortifications, the question inevitably arose: should they call upon the Iron Warriors to break the walls, or the Imperial Fists to starve out the defenders? Each success by one legion was seen as an implicit criticism of the other's approach. The seeds of the Iron Cage were planted not on any battlefield, but in the Imperial Palace itself. During the fortification of Terra, Dorn's defensive innovations were repeatedly tested against theoretical Iron Warriors' assault patterns. What should have been friendly competition between allied legions became an increasingly bitter rivalry over whose methods represented the true art of warfare. Veterans of both legions reported their Primarchs spending entire nights studying their counterparts' tactical manuals, searching for weaknesses that could be exploited. The breaking point came during the Siege of Terra, when Perturabo's siege engines finally breached sections of Dorn's supposedly impregnable palace defenses. For the first time in their existence, the Imperial Fists faced the humiliation of seeing their ultimate fortress penetrated by the very legion whose methods they had dismissed as crude and mechanical. The psychological impact of this failure would prove more devastating than any physical wound. What happened in the Iron Cage would prove that even the Emperor's most loyal sons could be broken by the very virtues that defined them. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, as the shattered Imperium struggled to rebuild itself from the ashes of civil war, both legions found themselves fundamentally changed by their experiences. The Iron Warriors, now sworn to chaos, had embraced a nihilistic philosophy that saw destruction as the only truth in an inherently corrupt universe. The Imperial Fists, traumatized by their failure to protect the Emperor, had developed an obsession with penitence that bordered on suicidal. Yet what neither legion understood was that their mutual hatred had evolved beyond simple rivalry into something far more dangerous. A symbiotic relationship where each side defined itself entirely in opposition to the other. The Iron Warriors had become the force that breaks everything, while the Imperial Fists had become the will that endures anything. When these two absolutes finally collided in the nightmare fortress of the Iron Cage, the result would redefine what it meant to be a Space Marine. The fragmentary records that survive speak of casualty rates that exceeded even the worst battles of the Horus Heresy. Entire companies of both legions simply vanished into the grinding machinery of mutual destruction, their gene seed lost forever to a conflict that served no strategic purpose beyond the satisfaction of pride. What began as a military engagement evolved into something that resembled ritual sacrifice more than warfare. The most disturbing aspect of the Iron Cage, according to those few Imperial observers who witnessed its aftermath, was not the scale of destruction, but the participants' apparent satisfaction with their mutual annihilation. Both sides seemed to consider their near extinction a form of victory, suggesting that the psychological damage went far deeper than anyone had realized. In a galaxy already consumed by endless war, the Iron Cage represented the moment when war itself became the only remaining form of meaning. For in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the Iron Cage stands as the ultimate proof that sometimes the greatest enemy is the reflection in the mirror. What unfolds on Sebastus IV will echo through 10 millennia of Imperial history, a cautionary tale of what happens when honor and duty are pushed beyond the boundaries of sanity into the realm of absolute obsession. The galaxy that emerged from the fires of the Horus Heresy bore little resemblance to the realm of hope and progress that had existed during the Great Crusade's Golden Age, where once the Imperium had expanded outward with the confident stride of manifest destiny. Now it huddled behind fortress walls, counting losses and struggling to maintain what remained of humanity's stellar empire. The very nature of warfare had changed. Gone were the days of glorious conquest and the liberation of lost human worlds. In their place came a grinding, defensive struggle against enemies that seemed to multiply faster than they could be destroyed. For the Imperial Fists, this transformation proved particularly devastating. They were a legion built around the concept of absolute defense, trained to hold positions until the last man fell and the last bolt shell was expended. During the Great Crusade, this specialization had made them invaluable. They were the hammer upon which enemy assaults broke, the immovable foundation that allowed other legions to operate with confidence. But in the post-heresy galaxy, their role had evolved from noble guardians into something far more grim, eternal sentinels watching over the slow decay of everything they had sworn to protect. The psychological toll of this shift cannot be understated. Rogal Dorn, the Praetorian of Terra, had spent his entire existence building fortifications designed to last forever. His greatest work, the Imperial Palace, had been conceived as the ultimate expression of defensive architecture, a fortress that would stand as long as humanity endured. The fact that chaos forces had breached its walls, that his mathematical certainties had proven fallible, created a crisis of identity that affected every warrior under his command. The signs were there for those who knew how to read them. Veteran sergeants reporting disturbing changes in their Primarch's demeanor. Captain Lysander of the First Company later recorded his growing concern about Dorn's behavior in the months following the Emperor's entombment. The Primarch had begun spending entire weeks in the deepest bunkers of the palace, reviewing defensive schematics and calculating angles of fire with an obsessive precision that exceeded even his usual standards. When questioned about strategic priorities, Dorn's responses showed an increasing disconnect from practical military concerns in favor of abstract theories about the mathematical perfection of fortification. More disturbing still were the reports from Imperial Fist apothecaries about changes in the Legion's combat doctrine, where once the Imperial Fists had fought with disciplined precision, maintaining formation and following established tactical protocols, they now showed a troubling tendency toward what could only be described as aggressive martyrdom. Companies were requesting assignments to the most dangerous sectors, volunteer rates for suicide missions reached unprecedented levels, and casualty rates climbed steadily as Imperial Fist units refused to retreat from untenable positions. The Legion's recruitment practices also began to shift in subtle but significant ways. Rather than seeking candidates who showed exceptional defensive instincts and patient temperament, Imperial Fist recruiting officers increasingly favored aspirants who demonstrated an unusual tolerance for pain and an almost pathological dedication to duty. The psychological conditioning programs were modified to emphasize endurance over tactical flexibility, creating Space Marines who would literally fight until their bodies failed rather than accept strategic withdrawal. Meanwhile, in the warp-touched forges of Medringard, Perturabo was designing what he called his masterworks, though none suspected its true purpose. The Iron Warriors' transformation proved even more dramatic than their loyalist counterparts, where the Imperial Fists had internalized their trauma and turned it into self-destructive devotion. The Iron Warriors had embraced chaos as an explanation for the fundamental corruption they perceived in the universe. Perturabo's bitter genius found new expression in the service of the Dark Gods, but his essential nature remained unchanged. He was still the supreme architect of destruction, still the mind that could see the weakest point in any structure and devise the most efficient method to exploit it. What had changed was the scope of his ambitions. During the Great Crusade, Perturabo had been content to break enemy fortresses in service of imperial expansion. Now, freed from the constraints of loyalty and military hierarchy, he could pursue destruction as an art form unto itself. The fortress cities of Medringard became testing grounds for increasingly elaborate siege engines and defensive systems, each designed to push the boundaries of what was possible in the marriage of technology and malice. Intelligence reports from deep-cover Imperial agents described Perturabo's growing obsession with a project he referred to only as the Perfect Siege. According to these fragmentary accounts, the Iron Warriors' Primarch had become convinced that it was possible to design a fortress that would serve simultaneously as an impregnable defense and an inescapable trap. Such a structure would represent the ultimate fusion of his two greatest talents: the ability to build fortifications that could not be taken, and the genius to create siege conditions that could not be survived. The mathematical complexity of this undertaking required resources that exceeded even the considerable capabilities of a Space Marine Legion. Perturabo began making alliances with chaos cults and rogue mechanicum forges, trading his tactical expertise for access to technologies that existed at the bleeding edge of heretical innovation. Daemon engines were incorporated into defensive systems, warp-touched metals were forged into walls that existed partially outside normal space-time, and siege weapons were constructed that drew their power from the raw hatred of the Immaterium itself. Yet beneath all this technological advancement lay a more personal motivation. Perturabo had never forgiven the Imperial Fists for their role in defending the Imperial Palace, had never accepted that Dorn's passive defensive strategies could be considered equal to his own aggressive engineering genius. The Perfect Siege was not just a theoretical exercise in military architecture. It was a trap specifically designed to exploit every tactical doctrine, every psychological weakness, every ingrained instinct that defined the Imperial Fists as a fighting force. The stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine what it meant to be an Astartes, though neither legion understood the price they would pay. The cosmic conditions that made the Iron Cage possible extended beyond the personal animosity between two Primarchs. The post-Heresy galaxy had become a place where absolute positions were not just possible but necessary for survival. The compromise and flexibility that had characterized the Great Crusade's diplomatic and military strategies were luxuries that the shattered Imperium could no longer afford. In this new reality, every decision had to be pushed to its logical extreme. Every principle had to be defended unto death, and every enemy had to be destroyed completely or not at all. This environmental pressure affected both legions in ways that would have been impossible during the more optimistic era of imperial expansion. The Imperial Fists, faced with an empire that was literally falling apart around them, had developed a siege mentality that made retreat psychologically impossible. The Iron Warriors, freed from any need to preserve imperial infrastructure or protect civilian populations, had embraced a philosophy of total war that made mercy or restraint equally impossible. Both legions were being driven toward extremes by forces beyond their control, but the specific nature of their specializations ensured that when they finally collided, the result would be unlike any conflict in imperial history. Where other legions might have fought until one side achieved decisive victory, the Iron Warriors and Imperial Fists were psychologically incapable of accepting anything less than the complete vindication of their respective philosophies. The intelligence networks of both sides had been tracking each other's movements for months, analyzing patterns and calculating probabilities with the obsessive precision that characterized both legions' approach to warfare. Each minor engagement, each tactical deployment, each strategic decision was being evaluated not just for its immediate military value, but for what it revealed about the opponent's psychological state and tactical doctrine. The transformation of two of the Emperor's most disciplined legions into something resembling mutual suicide cults did not happen overnight. Like all the greatest tragedies in Imperial history, the path to the Iron Cage was paved with small compromises and rational decisions that accumulated over time until they became an unstoppable avalanche of inevitability. What began as healthy competition between allied forces gradually evolved into a philosophical crusade that would accept no outcome short of absolute validation. For Rogal Dorn, the months following the Emperor's entombment represented a period of unprecedented soul-searching. The Praetorian of Terra had built his entire identity around the concept of perfect defense, the mathematical certainty that any fortress could be made impregnable through sufficient application of engineering genius and tactical precision. The breach of the Imperial Palace's walls had shattered more than just stone and adamantium. It had destroyed Dorn's fundamental understanding of his own purpose in the cosmos. The Imperial Fists began to notice changes in their Primarchs' behavior almost immediately. Where once Dorn had been content to delegate tactical decisions to his captains and focus on broader strategic concerns, he now insisted on personally reviewing every defensive installation, every fortification plan, every bunker placement within the palace complex. His attention to detail, already legendary among the legions, became obsessive to the point where veteran officers began expressing private concerns about their Primarch's mental state. The construction of what would later be known as the Pain Glove marked the first clear sign that Dorn's response to the palace's breach had moved beyond normal military analysis into something far darker. Officially described as a meditation chamber designed to focus the mind through controlled discomfort, the Pain Glove was actually a sophisticated torture device that subjected its occupant to precise levels of agony calibrated to maintain consciousness while maximizing suffering. Dorn's rationale for the device was characteristically logical and utterly terrifying. He had concluded that his failure to make the palace truly impregnable stemmed from an insufficient understanding of pain. Both the pain that attackers would endure to breach his defenses and the pain that defenders would accept to hold their positions. By subjecting himself to calculated torture, he believed he could achieve the psychological insights necessary to design fortifications that would account for every variable in the equation of siege warfare. The Imperial Fists' reaction to their Primarchs' new practices revealed the depth of their own psychological transformation. Rather than expressing concern or attempting to intervene, they began constructing similar devices for their own use. Within months, every Imperial Fist battle barge contained meditation chambers designed to inflict precisely calibrated suffering upon their occupants. The legion that had once prided itself on disciplined endurance had evolved into something that actively sought out pain as a form of spiritual purification. What Dorn didn't realize was that every fortress he built, every defensive strategy he perfected, was being cataloged by eyes that knew his methods better than his own sons. Perturabo's intelligence network had grown dramatically since his embrace of chaos. Where the Iron Warriors had once relied on conventional reconnaissance and battlefield analysis, they now supplemented their information gathering with demonic possession, warp scrying, and the services of chaos cults embedded within imperial institutions. This gave Perturabo an unprecedented level of insight into Imperial Fist operations, allowing him to observe Dorn's psychological deterioration in real time. The Iron Warrior's Primarch recognized opportunity in his rival's obsession. Every Pain Glove session was monitored through demonic surveillance. Every modification to Imperial Palace defenses was analyzed by corrupted tech priests. Every change in Imperial Fist tactical doctrine was studied by Iron Warrior strategists who understood exactly how to exploit their opponent's psychological weaknesses. Perturabo was not just gathering intelligence. He was studying Dorn like a specimen, cataloging every reaction and response in preparation for the ultimate test. The Iron Warriors themselves were undergoing their own transformation, though theirs was driven by ambition rather than guilt. Perturabo's embrace of chaos had opened new avenues for technological and tactical innovation that would have been impossible within the constraints of Imperial doctrine. Daemon engines were incorporated into siege equipment, allowing for weapons that could breach fortifications through methods that existed partially outside the normal laws of physics. Warp-touched ammunition was developed that could ignore conventional armor by existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously. More significantly, the Iron Warriors had begun experimenting with psychological warfare on a scale that exceeded anything attempted during the Great Crusade. Rather than simply breaking enemy fortifications through superior firepower, they now sought to break the minds of their opponents through carefully orchestrated campaigns of terror and demoralization. Fortress sieges became elaborate psychological experiments designed to test the limits of human endurance and the breaking points of different military cultures. The first Iron Warriors raiders struck like surgical knives. But their true purpose wasn't conquest, it was reconnaissance. The series of engagements that would later be recognized as the prelude to the Iron Cage began with what appeared to be random pirate attacks on Imperial supply convoys. Small forces of Iron Warriors, operating from hidden bases in the Maelstrom, would strike without warning at logistics trains and merchant vessels, inflicting maximum damage before disappearing back into the warp. Imperial intelligence initially dismissed these raids as opportunistic resource gathering by renegade space marines. The reality was far more sophisticated. Each attack was carefully planned to provoke a specific type of Imperial response, usually involving the deployment of Imperial Fist rapid response forces. The Iron Warriors would engage just long enough to observe their opponent's tactical doctrine in action, then withdraw before suffering significant casualties. Every Imperial Fist formation that responded to these provocations was being studied, analyzed, and cataloged for future reference. The psychological profile that emerged from these observations was deeply disturbing. The Imperial Fists were no longer fighting like rational military units seeking to achieve strategic objectives with minimal casualties. Instead, they were behaving like a death cult that measured success by the amount of suffering they could endure rather than the tactical advantages they could secure. Companies would deliberately seek out the most dangerous assignments, volunteer for missions with survival rates approaching zero, and refuse to retreat from positions that served no strategic value. Perturabo recognized this behavior pattern immediately because he had seen it before Mitters in the mirror. The Iron Warriors had undergone a similar transformation during their embrace of chaos, trading rational military thinking for an obsessive need to prove their philosophical superiority through increasingly extreme demonstrations of their capabilities. The difference was that the Iron Warriors had chosen their path consciously, while the Imperial Fists seemed to be sliding into self-destruction without even realizing what was happening to them. This realization gave birth to what Perturabo would later describe as his greatest inspiration. Rather than simply designing a fortress that could withstand Imperial Fist assault tactics, he would create a siege scenario that would force the Imperial Fists to destroy themselves through their own virtues. The perfect siege would not break the Imperial Fists through superior firepower, it would break them by giving them exactly what their psychological conditioning demanded: an opportunity to prove their absolute dedication to duty through ultimate sacrifice. By the time Dorn recognized the pattern, Perturabo had already achieved what no enemy had managed during the siege of Terab Fro. He had gotten inside the Praetorian's head. The moment of recognition came during a routine tactical briefing when Dorn was presented with intelligence reports detailing the Iron Warriors' raid patterns. The mathematical precision of the attacks, the careful selection of targets, the specific timing of engagements, all of it pointed to a level of intelligence gathering that exceeded normal military reconnaissance. Someone with intimate knowledge of Imperial Fist tactical doctrine was orchestrating these raids to maximize their psychological impact rather than their strategic value. For the first time since the Emperor's entombment, Dorn felt something approaching his old clarity of thought. The fog of guilt and self-recrimination that had clouded his judgment for months suddenly lifted, replaced by the cold certainty that he was being manipulated by an enemy who understood him better than he understood himself. The pain glove sessions, the defensive modifications, the increasingly extreme training regimens, all of it was being observed and analyzed by someone who could predict his responses with mathematical precision. The revelation should have been liberating. Recognizing that he was being psychologically manipulated should have allowed Dorn to step back from his obsessive pursuit of perfect defense and return to rational strategic thinking. Instead, it had the opposite effect. The knowledge that Perturabo was watching, studying, and preparing to exploit every weakness only intensified Dorn's need to prove that Imperial Fist defensive doctrine was superior to Iron Warrior's siege tactics. What followed was a period of escalating provocation on both sides as each legion tested the other's commitment to their respective philosophical extremes. Imperial Fist forces began conducting training exercises that were clearly intended to demonstrate their tactical capabilities to any Iron Warriors observers. Iron Warriors raiding parties started leaving behind evidence of their presence, weapons caches, fortification plans, tactical manuals, designed to taunt their Imperial counterparts with demonstrations of superior engineering and strategic thinking. The galaxy watched in growing alarm as two of the Emperor's most disciplined legions devolved into what could only be described as a mutual stalking behavior. Other Space Marine chapters began reporting increasingly aggressive requests for intelligence about Iron Warriors' movements from Imperial Fist commanders. Chaos warbands in the Eye of Terror found themselves recruited into Perturabo's growing network of informants and provocateurs. Both sides were mobilizing resources on a scale that suggested preparation for a major campaign, but neither was revealing their true objectives to Imperial or Chaos High Command. The point of no return was approaching with the inevitability of orbital mechanics, and both legions seemed powerless to alter their trajectory toward mutual destruction. The true scope of what both legions had become in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy was first revealed not through grand strategic campaigns, but in a series of seemingly unrelated engagements that demonstrated capabilities that exceeded even their legendary reputations. The Iron Warriors and Imperial Fists were no longer simply elite Space Marine formations. They had evolved into something that transcended normal military classifications, becoming living embodiments of their respective philosophies pushed to their absolute limits. The first documented evidence of this transformation came from the compliance action on Mordian 7, where an Imperial Fist strike force under Captain Maximus Thane encountered what appeared to be a routine planetary rebellion. Intelligence reports suggested that local PDF forces had barricaded themselves in the planetary capital's Fortress Cathedral, a structure that conventional wisdom deemed impregnable due to its combination of ancient architecture and modern defensive systems. Previous Imperial attempts to retake the cathedral had failed with casualties approaching 70%. What followed challenged every assumption about the relationship between tactical doctrine and strategic effectiveness. Rather than conducting a conventional siege or attempting to starve out the defenders, the Imperial Fists implemented what they termed a doctrine extremis assault that prioritized proof of concept over casualty minimization. The Battle Brothers advanced across open ground under concentrated fire, using their own bodies as mobile cover for specialized breaching teams. When the first wave was decimated, they sent a second. When the second was destroyed, they deployed a third. The mathematical impossibility of their success became apparent only in retrospect. By the seventh wave, Imperial Fist casualties had exceeded 400%, meaning that individual Battle Brothers were being wounded, treated, and returned to combat multiple times within the same engagement. Yet rather than breaking under this sustained punishment, the Imperial Fists seemed to draw strength from their suffering, fighting with an intensity that transcended normal human psychology. The Fortress Cathedral fell not because its defenses were breached by superior tactics, but because its defenders simply could not comprehend an enemy willing to accept unlimited casualties in pursuit of victory. Veteran Space Marines from other legions began reporting an unsettling phenomenon. Both sides seemed to be fighting not just to win, but to prove something that went beyond victory. The Iron Warriors' response to reports of the Mordian 7 action was characteristically methodical and absolutely terrifying. Rather than dismissing their rival's success as a Pyrrhic victory achieved through waste of resources, Perturabo recognized it as evidence that the Imperial Fists had successfully weaponized their own destruction. The mathematical precision with which they had calculated acceptable loss ratios, the psychological conditioning that allowed them to function effectively while sustaining casualties that would break any normal military unit. These were innovations that demanded immediate study and eventual surpassing. The opportunity for field testing came when Iron Warriors' forces encountered the fortress world of Castellax Prime, defended by a mixed force of Imperial Guard regiments and Space Marine auxiliaries from the Salamanders chapter. The world's defenses had been designed according to Imperial Fist principles: layered defensive positions, overlapping fields of fire, and fallback positions that could be held even after the primary fortifications were breached. It was exactly the type of challenge that would have required months of conventional siege warfare to overcome. Perturabo's solution demonstrated that the Iron Warriors had undergone their own philosophical evolution. Rather than simply applying superior firepower to break the defenses, they implemented what they called Siege Totalis, a systematic campaign designed to destroy not just the enemy's ability to resist, but their will to exist. The Iron Warriors began by targeting the planet's civilian population centers, but not to inflict casualties. Instead, they constructed elaborate execution devices in full view of the defending forces, then proceeded to torture captured civilians to death while broadcasting the screams across all Imperial communication frequencies. The psychological impact was devastating and immediate. The Salamanders, known throughout the Imperium for their protection of civilian populations, began abandoning tactically sound defensive positions to attempt rescue operations that were obviously suicidal. Imperial Guard units, watching their families being systematically murdered, lost all semblance of military discipline and either deserted en masse or launched hopeless attacks against obviously superior positions. Within 72 hours, a fortress world that should have held out for months had collapsed completely. Not because its defenses had been breached, but because its defenders had been driven beyond the limits of psychological endurance. The Iron Warriors had achieved victory through a level of cruelty that exceeded even Chaos standards, proving that they could break any enemy by targeting the humanitarian instincts that made them human. The breaking point came when Perturabo's forces encountered an Imperial Fist fortress that had been designed specifically to counter Iron Warriors' siege tactics. The Fortress of Majestic Station represented the culmination of everything Rogal Dorn had learned about defensive architecture since the breach of the Imperial Palace. Built on an asteroid in the outer reaches of the Segmentum Solar, it served no strategic purpose beyond demonstrating that Imperial Fist engineering could create truly impregnable fortifications. Every lesson learned from studying Iron Warriors' siege methods had been incorporated into its design. Overlapping defensive fields that eliminated blind spots, hardened bunkers that could withstand direct bombardment from Chaos Titan weapons, and automated defense systems that could function even if the entire garrison was killed. More significantly, the fortress had been designed with a specific psychological profile of Iron Warriors' assault doctrine in mind. Rather than simply trying to create impenetrable defenses, Dorn had crafted a structure that would force attacking Iron Warriors to confront the mathematical impossibility of their own methods. Every approach route was designed to funnel attackers into predetermined kill zones where they could be systematically destroyed. Every breaching point was protected by overlapping defensive systems that would require exponentially increasing casualties to overcome. The psychological warfare component was even more sophisticated. The fortress was equipped with massive holographic displays that showed real-time casualty counts to attacking forces, along with mathematical projections of how many Iron Warriors would need to die to achieve even marginal tactical gains. Automated broadcast systems would transmit detailed analyses of failed assault attempts, highlighting the tactical incompetence that had led to unnecessary casualties. The fortress itself had become a weapon designed to break Iron Warriors' morale by forcing them to confront the human cost of their preferred tactics. Perturabo's response to this challenge revealed the true depth of his transformation. Rather than approaching Majestic Station as a military problem to be solved through superior tactics, he treated it as a personal insult that demanded absolute retaliation. The siege that followed lasted for 3 months and consumed resources equivalent to a full sector campaign. But the Iron Warriors Primarch was not seeking a cost-effective victory. He was seeking to prove that no defensive system, no matter how sophisticated, could withstand Iron Warriors' siege methods when applied with sufficient determination. The mathematical elegance of Perturabo's solution was matched only by its complete disregard for military logic. Rather than trying to breach the fortress's defenses directly, he began constructing siege works that surrounded Majestic Station with their own fortifications. The Iron Warriors were not trying to break into the Imperial Fist stronghold. They were building a fortress around it, creating a siege within a siege that turned the asteroid itself into a massive trap. What should have been a routine compliance action turned into a bloodbath that left both sides with a disturbing realization. They were no longer fighting for the Imperium or Chaos, but for something far more personal and dangerous. The siege of Majestic Station lasted exactly 97 days, during which both sides committed resources and personnel far beyond any rational strategic calculation. The Iron Warriors constructed siege works that exceeded the complexity of anything they had built during the Great Crusade, while the Imperial Fists inside the fortress pushed their defensive capabilities to previously unimaginable extremes. Both sides were fighting with an intensity that transcended normal military objectives, driven by the need to prove their respective philosophies superior. The end came not through tactical brilliance or strategic innovation, but through mutual exhaustion that bordered on mutual annihilation. The Iron Warriors had succeeded in breaching the fortress's outer defenses, but at a cost that exceeded their ability to exploit the victory. The Imperial Fists had maintained their defensive positions, but their garrison had been reduced to a handful of survivors who lacked the strength to operate their remaining weapons systems. Both sides declared victory in the aftermath, but veteran observers from other legions recognized something far more disturbing in the reports from Majestic Station. The Iron Warriors and Imperial Fists had not fought like rational military units seeking to achieve strategic objectives. They had fought like religious fanatics seeking martyrdom in service of abstract principles. The casualties on both sides exceeded reasonable tactical parameters, yet both legions seemed to consider their losses a form of success rather than failure. The psychological analysis conducted by Imperial intelligence services reached a conclusion that would prove prophetic. Both legions had evolved beyond conventional military thinking into something that resembled competing death cults. Their specializations had become obsessions, their tactical doctrines had become religious beliefs, and their rivalry had become a form of mutual worship through violence. The stage was set for a confrontation that would push both forces beyond the boundaries of sanity, into a realm where victory and defeat became indistinguishable from mutual suicide. To understand the true tragedy of what the Iron Warriors and Imperial Fists became, one must first comprehend the magnificence of what they had once been. During the golden age of the Great Crusade, both legions represented the pinnacle of the Emperor's vision for transhuman warfare, specialized forces capable of solving military problems that would have been impossible for lesser formations. Their achievements during this period were not merely tactical victories, but demonstrations of human potential unleashed and directed toward the conquest of the galaxy. The Imperial Fists' mastery of defensive warfare during their peak years bordered on the supernatural. Under Rogal Dorn's guidance, they had developed fortification techniques that incorporated principles from architecture, mathematics, psychology, and physics to create strongholds that existed as much in the realm of abstract theory as physical space. The Great Wall of Inwit, constructed during Dorn's early years as Primarch, remained standing 2 centuries after its completion, despite sustained assault from enemies that included Chaos Warbands, Orge, Ag Ace, and Xenos Raiders equipped with weapons capable of cracking continents. Yet beneath the glory and the victories, something darker was taking root, a competitive obsession that would outlast loyalty, brotherhood, and even sanity itself. The technological innovations developed by the Imperial Fists during this period represented a revolution in defensive thinking that influenced Imperial military doctrine for millennia. Their development of adaptive fortification, defensive systems that could modify their configuration in real time based on enemy assault patterns, allowed relatively small garrisons to hold positions against numerically superior forces. The mathematical precision with which they calculated angles of fire, overlapping defensive fields and structural weak points elevated fortress design from engineering to art. More significantly, the Imperial Fists had mastered the psychological aspects of defensive warfare in ways that their rivals never fully comprehended. They understood that the ultimate purpose of fortification was not simply to prevent enemy advancement, but to break enemy morale through the demonstration of futility. An Imperial Fist fortress was designed to show attacking forces that every possible approach had been anticipated. Every potential weakness had been reinforced, and every tactical option led inevitably to defeat. The organizational structure of the Imperial Fists at their height reflected this philosophical commitment to absolute defense. Unlike other legions that maintain flexibility in their command hierarchy to adapt to changing battlefield conditions, the Imperial Fists operated according to rigid protocols that ensured consistent defensive doctrine regardless of casualties or field conditions. Every battle brother was trained not just in combat techniques, but in the mathematical principles underlying fortress design, allowing them to construct effective defensive positions even when separated from their command structure. This psychological conditioning created warriors who were literally incapable of accepting defeat as long as defensive positions remained viable. Imperial Fists would fight from prepared positions until their ammunition was exhausted. then continue fighting with improvised weapons. When their weapons were destroyed, they would use their bodies as barricades to delay enemy advance. The concept of strategic withdrawal was not simply discouraged, it was psychologically impossible for Imperial Fists who had been properly conditioned according to Legion doctrine. The methods that made them the Imperium's greatest specialists also contained the seeds of their most catastrophic failure. Perturabo's Iron Warriors represented the perfect mirror to the Imperial Fists' defensive mastery. They were the unstoppable force that could break any fortification through the application of superior engineering, mathematical precision, and absolute determination. Their achievements during the Great Crusade's siege campaigns were legendary even among the other legions, who recognized the Iron Warriors as specialists capable of solving problems that would have stalled conventional military operations for years. The Iron Warriors' approach to siege warfare was fundamentally different from the crude throw enough firepower at the problem mentality employed by many Imperial forces. Under Perturabo's guidance, they had developed siege techniques that treated fortress breaking as a precise science requiring careful analysis of structural engineering, defensive psychology, and resource allocation. Every wall was studied to identify its weakest point. Every defensive position was analyzed to determine its optimal approach, and every enemy fortification was reduced through methods that minimized Iron Warriors' casualties while maximizing destruction efficiency. Perturabo's genius lay not just in his ability to break enemy fortresses, but in his understanding of how to turn fortress design principles against themselves. Where other commanders saw impregnable walls, Perturabo saw structural elements that could be undermined through precise application of force. Where others saw overlapping defensive fields, he saw mathematical patterns that could be exploited through careful timing and positioning. The Iron Warriors didn't simply break fortresses, they demonstrated that the very concept of impregnable defense was a mathematical impossibility when confronted by sufficient analytical precision. The technological innovations developed by the Iron Warriors during this period influenced Imperial siege doctrine in ways that are still evident 10 millennia later. Their development of cascade breaching, siege techniques that used the structural failure of one defensive element to trigger the systematic collapse of entire fortification networks, allowed them to achieve in hours what conventional siege methods would have required months to accomplish. The mathematical models they created for calculating optimal siege approaches became standard Imperial Guard doctrine and remain classified at the highest levels of Imperial intelligence. More importantly, the Iron Warriors had mastered the psychological aspects of siege warfare in ways that complemented their technical expertise. They understood that the ultimate purpose of fortress breaking was not simply to breach enemy defenses, but to demonstrate the futility of resistance against superior analytical thinking. An Iron Warrior's siege was designed to show defending forces that their fortifications had been mathematically analyzed, their weaknesses identified, and their destruction reduced to an engineering problem with a predetermined solution. The organizational structure of the Iron Warriors reflected this commitment to mathematical precision in all aspects of warfare. Unlike other legions that relied on battlefield intuition and adaptive tactics, the Iron Warriors operated according to calculated protocols that had been tested and refined through centuries of siege operations. Every battle brother was trained not just in combat techniques, but in the engineering principles underlying fortress analysis, allowing them to identify structural weaknesses and calculate optimal breach points even in the midst of active combat. This created warriors who approached warfare as applied mathematics rather than martial artistry. Iron Warriors would analyze enemy positions with the same precision they applied to mechanical engineering problems, identifying variables, calculating probabilities, and implementing solutions with mechanical efficiency. The concept of impossible fortress was not simply rejected, but mathematically disproven through systematic analysis that reduced every defensive system to its component vulnerabilities. Neither Primarch understood that their greatest strength, their unwillingness to accept defeat, would become the weapon their enemy would use to destroy them. The hidden flaw in both legions' philosophical approach lay not in their methods, but in their psychological conditioning. Both the Imperial Fists and Iron Warriors had been trained to view their specialized roles as more than military functions. They were expressions of fundamental truths about the nature of warfare itself. Imperial Fists didn't simply build fortresses, they proved that proper defensive thinking could overcome any assault. Iron Warriors didn't simply break fortifications, they demonstrated that analytical precision could overcome any obstacle. This elevation of tactical specialization to philosophical principle created a psychological trap that would eventually consume both legions. Because their methods had proven successful in every previous application, both Primarchs had developed an absolute confidence in their respective approaches that made compromise or adaptation impossible. When the unstoppable force finally met the immovable object, neither side could accept anything less than complete vindication of their worldview. The competitive dynamic that developed between Dorn and Perturabo during the Great Crusade was initially beneficial to Imperial military effectiveness. Each Primarch's awareness of his rival's capabilities drove continuous innovation and improvement in their respective specializations. Imperial Fist fortifications became increasingly sophisticated as Dorn incorporated defenses against known Iron Warriors' siege techniques. Iron Warriors' siege methods became more refined as Perturabo developed counters to Imperial Fist defensive innovations. But this healthy competition gradually evolved into something more dangerous, as both Primarchs began to view their rival's existence as an implicit challenge to their own identity. Dorn's confidence in defensive supremacy was undermined by the knowledge that Perturabo could break any fortress given sufficient time and resources. Perturabo's pride in his siege mastery was threatened by Dorn's ability to create fortifications that required increasingly extreme methods to overcome. The psychological pressure created by this rivalry was intensified by the Emperor's tendency to assign both legions to campaigns where their methods would be directly compared. Rather than recognizing this as an opportunity for collaboration, both Primarchs viewed these joint operations as contests that would determine which approach to warfare represented superior thinking. Every successful siege became evidence of Iron Warriors' supremacy. Every successful defense became proof of Imperial Fist's superiority. The final element that would eventually destroy both legions was their shared obsession with absolute solutions. Neither Dorn nor Perturabo was capable of accepting partial victory or strategic compromise. Their psychological conditioning demanded complete vindication of their methods through total success. This created a dynamic where any confrontation between the two forces would inevitably escalate beyond rational strategic parameters into a test of fundamental principles that could only be resolved through mutual destruction. The stage was set for a tragedy that would redefine the nature of loyalty, duty, and honor in the grim darkness of the far future. The philosophical cancer that would eventually consume both legions began as what appeared to be tactical innovation and doctrinal refinement. In the years following the Horus Heresy, both the Imperial Fists and Iron Warriors found their specialized approaches to warfare being studied, copied, and adapted by forces throughout the galaxy. What had once been the exclusive domain of two elite legions gradually spread through Imperial and Chaos military hierarchies, carrying with it the psychological toxins that would transform routine military operations into exercises in mutual annihilation. The Imperial Fist defensive doctrine proved particularly influential among the newly formed successor chapters. The Crimson Fists, Black Templars, and Imperial Fists proper all carried forward variations of Dorn's fortification principles, but each interpretation reflected the psychological trauma that had shaped the parent legion in the aftermath of the Imperial Palace's breach. Where once Imperial Fist defensive doctrine had emphasized rational analysis of terrain and tactical positioning, the new variants increasingly focused on what could only be described as sanctified suffering. The Black Templars took this evolution to its logical extreme, developing a combat philosophy that treated defensive positions as altars upon which warriors could demonstrate their worthiness through endurance of pain. Their fortress monasteries were designed not simply to repel attackers, but to subject their own defenders to systematic hardship that would purify their souls through controlled suffering. Training exercises that would have been considered torture by other chapters became standard practice for Black Templars neophytes. What began as tactical specialization was evolving into something far more dangerous. A philosophical crusade that would accept no compromise. The Crimson Fists developed their own variation of this theme, constructing defensive positions that incorporated deliberate weaknesses designed to draw enemy fire toward specific sections of their fortifications. Rather than seeking to minimize casualties through superior defensive architecture, they created killing fields where their own warriors could demonstrate their dedication to duty by accepting wounds in service of tactical objectives. The mathematical precision with which they calculated acceptable loss ratios exceeded even the Iron Warriors' analytical approaches to siege warfare. Most disturbing of all, these developments were being celebrated rather than questioned by Imperial military authorities. The Codex Astartes was quietly amended to include references to sacrificial defense doctrine and pain-oriented tactical conditioning as acceptable variations on standard Space Marine training methods. What had once been recognized as symptoms of psychological trauma were being institutionalized as legitimate military innovations. The spread of Iron Warrior's siege techniques through Chaos forces proved even more catastrophic in its implications. Traitor warbands throughout the Eye of Terror began incorporating Perturabo's mathematical approaches to fortress breaking, but without the disciplined analytical framework that had originally justified these methods. The result was a proliferation of siege techniques that prioritized the infliction of suffering over tactical effectiveness. Chaos forces began constructing siege works that were designed primarily to maximize the psychological trauma inflicted upon defending forces rather than to achieve rapid tactical victory. The mathematical models developed by the Iron Warriors for calculating optimal breach points were perverted into algorithms for identifying which defensive positions would create the most terror when systematically destroyed. Fortress breaking evolved from applied engineering into ritualized torture conducted on an architectural scale. Other Space Marine commanders began to notice disturbing patterns in how both legions conducted warfare, patterns that suggested their loyalty might be more complex than simple devotion to the Imperium. The reports that reached Terra from frontline commanders throughout the galaxy painted a picture of two legions that had moved beyond normal military thinking into something that resembled competing religious movements. Imperial Fist forces were requesting assignments to the most dangerous sectors not because these positions held strategic value, but because they offered opportunities for maximum suffering in service of defensive doctrine. Iron Warriors' warbands were targeting Imperial positions with a frequency that exceeded strategic necessity, focusing their attacks on fortifications that had been constructed according to Imperial Fist principles. More alarming still were the intelligence reports suggesting that both sides were sharing tactical information despite their theoretical allegiance to opposing causes. Intercepted communications revealed that Iron Warriors' siege specialists were studying detailed analyses of Imperial Fist defensive positions, while Imperial Fist fortress designers were incorporating countermeasures specifically designed to counter Iron Warriors' siege techniques. The two forces appeared to be locked in a collaborative effort to push their respective specializations to absolute extremes. The psychological profiles compiled by Imperial Intelligence Services revealed that veterans of both legions showed similar patterns of obsessive thinking that transcended normal military conditioning. Imperial Fist survivors described their service in terms that resembled religious devotion to the concept of perfect defense, while Iron Warriors defectors spoke of siege warfare as a form of mathematical worship that reduced all problems to equations of destruction. Both groups showed an inability to conceive of tactical situations that did not involve their specialized form of warfare. Imperial Guard regiments that had served alongside Imperial Fist forces began reporting disturbing changes in their own tactical doctrine. Exposure to Imperial Fist defensive methods created a psychological contagion that spread through conventional military units, leading to dramatic increases in casualty rates as Imperial Guard forces began implementing suicidal defensive strategies that prioritized symbolic resistance over tactical effectiveness. Entire regiments would request assignment to obviously hopeless defensive positions, then fight to the last man rather than accept strategic withdrawal. Similarly, Chaos cults throughout the Imperium began adopting Iron Warriors' siege techniques not as military tools, but as methods for conducting ritualized destruction of Imperial installations. These corrupted siege methods were being used to target civilian infrastructure, religious sites, and cultural monuments with a precision that served no strategic purpose beyond the demonstration of analytical supremacy over Imperial defensive thinking. The spreading influence created feedback loops that intensified the psychological pressure on both parent legions. Imperial Fist commanders, aware that their defensive doctrine was being studied and adapted throughout the galaxy, felt increasing pressure to prove that their original methods remained superior to all variations. Iron Warriors warlords, watching their siege techniques being corrupted by lesser forces, became obsessed with demonstrating that true fortress breaking required the mathematical precision that only they possessed. The incident at Sebastus IV would prove that when two unstoppable forces of will collide, the result isn't victory. It's mutual annihilation. The preliminary skirmishes that would eventually escalate into the Iron Cage began with what appeared to be routine territorial disputes in the Segmentum Solar. Iron Warriors raiding forces had established hidden bases in several uninhabited systems, using these positions to launch attacks against Imperial shipping and military installations. The raids followed no discernible strategic pattern beyond their focus on targets that would inevitably provoke Imperial Fist response forces. Imperial intelligence initially dismissed these attacks as opportunistic resource gathering by renegade space marines seeking to rebuild their strength after the Horus Heresy. The reality was far more sophisticated and infinitely more dangerous. Each raid was carefully calculated to test specific aspects of Imperial Fist defensive doctrine, with Iron Warriors forces engaging just long enough to observe their opponent's tactical responses before withdrawing to analyze the data. The psychological manipulation was subtle, but devastating in its effectiveness. Rather than seeking to inflict maximum casualties or capture strategic objectives, the Iron Warriors were conducting what amounted to field experiments designed to map the limits of Imperial Fist's psychological conditioning. They would attack defensive positions that could be held indefinitely, then measure how long Imperial Fist forces would maintain their positions despite the obvious futility of their situation. The Imperial Fist's responses to these provocations revealed the depth of their psychological transformation. Rather than adapting their tactics to counter Iron Warriors' strategies, they began implementing increasingly extreme defensive measures that prioritized demonstration of doctrinal purity over tactical effectiveness. Companies would volunteer for obviously suicidal assignments, construct defensive positions in locations that served no strategic purpose, and maintain watch over empty sectors simply to prove their commitment to defensive doctrine. Both legions were being drawn into a spiral of escalating provocation that neither side seemed capable of breaking. Each Iron Warriors raid prompted increasingly extreme Imperial Fist responses, which in turn justified more sophisticated Iron Warriors attacks designed to test the limits of their opponent's endurance. The mathematical precision with which both sides calculated the escalation suggested that the conflict was being orchestrated according to some larger design that transcended normal military objectives. The realization that they were being manipulated should have prompted both legions to step back from the brink and return to rational strategic thinking. Instead, it had the opposite effect, intensifying their need to prove that their respective approaches to warfare were superior to any form of psychological manipulation. The trap was closing around both forces, and their own virtues had become the chains that bound them to mutual destruction. The transformation of healthy military rivalry into pathological obsession did not happen overnight, but the warning signs were there for those who knew how to recognize them. What Imperial observers dismissed as post-heresy trauma was actually something far more insidious, a shared madness that transcended the loyalty-treachery divide and threatened to consume both legions in a spiral of self-destruction disguised as tactical innovation. The first clear indication that something had gone fundamentally wrong with Imperial Fist's psychological conditioning came from their own apothecaries, who began reporting anomalous patterns in battle brother behavior that exceeded normal stress responses to combat trauma. Imperial Fist warriors were seeking out opportunities for unnecessary suffering with a frequency that suggested psychological addiction rather than tactical commitment. The pain glove sessions that had originally been intended as meditation aids were being used with increasing frequency and intensity, creating dependency patterns that resembled religious obsession more than military conditioning. What Imperial observers dismissed as post-heresy trauma was actually something far more insidious, a shared madness that transcended the loyalties-treachery divide. Captain Lysander's private logs from this period reveal the growing concern among Imperial Fist leadership about changes in their battle brothers' behavior patterns. Veterans who had previously shown exemplary tactical judgment were now volunteering for assignments that offered no strategic value beyond their potential for inflicting maximum casualties on Imperial Fist forces. When questioned about their motivations, these warriors would cite passages from Dorn's tactical manuals that had been taken completely out of context and twisted into justifications for organized suicide. More disturbing still were the reports of Imperial Fist companies abandoning tactically sound defensive positions to seek out confrontations with obviously superior enemy forces. These engagements followed no recognizable strategic pattern beyond their potential for demonstrating Imperial Fist commitment to defensive doctrine through maximum suffering. Battle brothers were treating casualty rates as measures of success rather than tactical failures to be minimized. The psychological conditioning that had once made the Imperial Fists the galaxy's premier defensive specialists was being perverted into something that resembled a death cult more than a military organization. Training exercises that should have focused on tactical effectiveness instead emphasized endurance of pain and acceptance of feudal missions. Neophyte conditioning programs were modified to include psychological elements designed to eliminate survival instincts that might interfere with absolute commitment to defensive positions. Imperial Fist recruitment practices also began showing disturbing changes that reflected their psychological evolution. Rather than seeking candidates who showed exceptional defensive instincts and tactical intelligence, recruiting officers increasingly favored aspirants who demonstrated unusual tolerance for pain and pathological dedication to abstract principles. The psychological screening process was modified to identify individuals who would choose death over retreat under any circumstances whatsoever. The pattern suggested something that imperial doctrine couldn't acknowledge: that loyalty and rebellion might be less important than the need to prove absolute superiority. Meanwhile, intelligence reports from deep within the Eye of Terror revealed that the Iron Warriors were undergoing their own psychological transformation that mirrored their loyalist counterparts in disturbing ways. Chaos cults that had attempted to recruit Iron Warriors' support found themselves dealing with warriors who showed no interest in the traditional rewards of chaos worship, power, immortality, or demonic favor. Instead, the Iron Warriors seemed obsessed with pursuing siege warfare as an abstract art form that transcended material objectives. Perturabo's own behavior during this period showed signs of psychological deterioration that exceeded normal chaos corruption. Rather than seeking to expand his power base or advance his standing among the chaos gods, he became increasingly focused on theoretical problems related to fortress design and siege methodology. His communications with other Chaos warlords showed a growing disinterest in strategic objectives in favor of mathematical discussions about optimal siege approaches and defensive countermeasures. The Iron Warriors under his command began showing similar patterns of obsessive thinking that prioritized doctrinal purity over tactical effectiveness. Warband leaders would abandon profitable raids to pursue siege opportunities that offered no strategic value beyond their potential for demonstrating Iron Warriors' analytical superiority. Resources that should have been allocated to rebuilding the Legion's strength were instead consumed by increasingly elaborate siege exercises designed to test theoretical approaches to fortress breaking. Most alarming of all were the reports suggesting that the Iron Warriors were deliberately seeking out confrontations with Imperial Fist forces despite the obvious tactical disadvantages of engaging loyalist Space Marines. These encounters followed no strategic pattern beyond their potential for testing Iron Warriors' siege methods against Imperial Fist defensive doctrine. Both sides appeared to be treating these engagements as experiments rather than military operations. The psychological profiles compiled by Chaos Intelligence Services revealed that Iron Warriors veterans showed the same obsessive thinking patterns that characterized their Imperial Fist counterparts. They described siege warfare in terms that resembled religious devotion to mathematical principles, treating fortress breaking as a form of worship that demonstrated the superiority of analytical thinking over all other approaches to problem solving. By the time Imperial Command realized what was happening, both legions were already committed to a course that would end only in the complete destruction of one side, or both. The first direct confrontation that revealed the true scope of both legions' psychological deterioration occurred during the Siege of Cardian Prime, where Iron Warriors and Imperial Fist forces found themselves engaged in what should have been a routine compliance action. The planet's PDF had barricaded themselves in a series of interconnected fortress cities that could have been reduced through conventional siege methods within a matter of weeks. Instead, the engagement evolved into a 3-month nightmare that consumed resources equivalent to a sector-wide campaign, while achieving tactical objectives that could have been accomplished by a single company of normal Space Marines. The Iron Warriors began constructing siege works that exceeded any reasonable tactical requirements, creating elaborate fortress-breaking systems designed to demonstrate theoretical principles rather than achieve rapid victory. The Imperial Fists responded by reinforcing the existing defensive positions to a degree that served no strategic purpose beyond proving their commitment to defensive doctrine. Both sides began implementing tactical innovations that prioritized demonstration of doctrinal superiority over casualty minimization or resource conservation. Iron Warriors' siege engines were designed to break fortifications through methods that maximized the analytical complexity of the assault rather than its effectiveness. Imperial Fist defensive positions were modified to create unnecessary opportunities for their defenders to demonstrate endurance through suffering. The engagement should have ended within days when it became clear that both sides were achieving their stated objectives. Instead, It continued for months, as each legion sought to prove that their approach to warfare represented superior thinking. Casualty rates climbed steadily as both forces abandoned normal tactical constraints in favor of increasingly extreme demonstrations of their respective capabilities. When the siege finally ended, both sides declared victory, despite having suffered losses that exceeded any reasonable strategic calculation. The Iron Warriors had successfully breached the fortress cities, but at a cost that negated any tactical advantage gained. The Imperial Fists had maintained their defensive positions, but their garrison had been reduced to a handful of survivors who lacked the strength to exploit their successful defense. The post-action reports compiled by neutral observers revealed patterns of behavior that challenged fundamental assumptions about Space Marine psychology and conditioning. Both legions had fought with an intensity that exceeded normal military parameters. Driven by motivations that transcended tactical objectives or strategic goals, they were no longer fighting for the Imperium or chaos, they were fighting for abstract principles that had become more important than survival itself. The mathematical precision with which both sides had calculated their acceptable loss ratios suggested that they were treating warfare as applied philosophy rather than military necessity. Every casualty was being measured against theoretical frameworks that prioritized doctrinal validation over practical effectiveness. Both legions had evolved beyond conventional military thinking into something that resembled competing academic movements expressing their disagreements through ritualized violence. The implications were terrifying in their scope. If two of the Emperor's most disciplined legions could be reduced to this state through their own virtues turned against them, what did that suggest about the fundamental stability of Space Marine psychology? The answer to that question would soon be written in blood across the killing fields of Sebastus IV, where the ultimate test of Imperial Fist defensive doctrine against Iron Warriors' siege methodology would finally take place. The stage was set for a confrontation that would prove that in the grim darkness of the far future, sometimes the greatest enemy is the reflection in the mirror, and the most dangerous corruption is the perversion of virtue itself. The Iron Cage represented something unprecedented in the annals of Imperial military history, a fortress specifically designed not to serve any strategic purpose, but to function as the ultimate testing ground for competing philosophies of warfare. Perturabo's masterwork was not intended to protect valuable resources, control strategic positions, or even survive the inevitable assault. It was a mathematical equation rendered in adamantium and ceramite, a theorem of destruction that would prove once and for all whether Imperial Fist defensive doctrine could withstand the analytical precision of Iron Warriors' siege methodology. The fortress itself defied conventional military architecture in ways that should have served as warnings to any rational commander. Built on Sebastus IV, a world with no strategic value beyond its proximity to major Imperial shipping lanes, the Iron Cage occupied a position that made no tactical sense according to standard defensive doctrine. It controlled no vital resources, protected no civilian populations, and offered no advantages that would justify the massive investment of materials and labor required for its construction. What made the Iron Cage truly terrifying was not its size or firepower, but the mathematical precision with which it had been designed to exploit every known weakness in Imperial Fist tactical doctrine. Perturabo had spent decades studying his rivals' methods, cataloging their psychological responses, and identifying the cognitive biases that drove their decision-making processes. The fortress was not simply a defensive installation. It was a psychological weapon designed to turn the Imperial Fist's greatest strengths against themselves. The Iron Warriors had achieved what no enemy had managed in 200 years of warfare. They had created a fortress that actually became stronger the more fiercely it was attacked. The defensive architecture of the Iron Cage incorporated principles that existed at the intersection of military engineering and psychological warfare. Every approach route was designed to offer defenders multiple opportunities to inflict casualties on attacking forces while simultaneously creating the illusion that breakthrough was possible with just one more assault. The fortress walls were constructed using a mathematical technique called cascade failure optimization. They were designed to collapse in predetermined patterns that would funnel attacking forces into increasingly deadly kill zones. More sophisticated still were the psychological warfare elements built into the fortress design itself. The Iron Cage was equipped with massive holographic displays that showed real-time casualty counts to Imperial Fist forces, along with mathematical projections that demonstrated the exponentially increasing cost of continued assault. Automated broadcast systems transmitted detailed tactical analyses that highlighted every Imperial Fist tactical error, while simultaneously offering helpful suggestions for alternative approaches that would prove equally futile. The fortress walls were inscribed with quotes from Rogal Dorn's own tactical manuals, taken out of context and arranged to suggest that the Praetorian himself would have considered the assault tactically impossible. Hidden speakers throughout the structure broadcast recordings of Imperial Fist battle cries and fortress-breaking techniques, creating an audio environment that reminded attackers of their own methods being used against them. Perhaps most insidious of all was the fortress's use of mirror architecture, defensive positions that were deliberately constructed to resemble Imperial Fist fortifications, forcing attackers to breach walls that looked exactly like structures they would normally defend. The psychological impact of this technique was devastating, creating cognitive dissonance that interfered with normal tactical thinking and decision-making processes. The first Imperial Fist reconnaissance forces to survey the Iron Cage returned with reports that should have triggered immediate strategic withdrawal. The fortress was obviously a trap designed specifically to exploit Imperial Fist tactical doctrines and psychological conditioning. Any rational military commander would have classified it as a no-win scenario and sought alternative methods for dealing with the Iron Warrior's threat. Initial siege attempts revealing the trap's sophistication. Captain Maximus Thane's preliminary assault revealed the true genius of Perturabo's design. The Iron Cage was not simply a fortress that could withstand Imperial Fist attacks. It was a fortress that became more effective the more Imperial Fist tactical doctrine was applied against it. Every established siege-breaking technique that the Imperial Fists attempted played directly into defensive systems that had been specifically designed to counter those exact methods. The first probing attacks encountered defensive positions that seemed to offer genuine opportunities for breakthrough, but each apparent weakness was actually a carefully constructed trap that would consume additional Imperial Fist resources, while revealing more information about their tactical approaches. The fortress was essentially a learning algorithm rendered in physical form, gathering data about Imperial Fist methods and adapting its defenses accordingly. When the Imperial Fists attempted to establish siege lines according to standard doctrine, they found that the fortress's automated defensive systems had been programmed to target these positions with mathematical precision. When they tried to breach the walls using conventional explosives, they discovered that the fortress was designed to channel explosive force into predetermined directions that would actually strengthen the remaining defensive structures. Most disturbing of all was the fortress's response to Imperial Fist attempts at tactical innovation. Every new approach that the Imperial Fists developed was quickly analyzed by the fortress's computational systems and countered with defensive measures that seemed to anticipate their thinking. The Iron Cage was not simply defending against known Imperial Fist tactics. It was predicting and countering tactics that hadn't even been implemented yet. The growing casualty rates that should have triggered retreat instead prompted the Imperial Fists to implement strategies that could only be described as organized suicide. Rather than acknowledging that they faced an impossible tactical situation, they began treating the Iron Cage as a test of their commitment to defensive doctrine, rather than a military objective to be achieved through rational methods. Company commanders began requesting permission to conduct honor assaults that served no tactical purpose beyond demonstrating Imperial Fist dedication to their principles. Battle Brothers volunteered for missions that offered no possibility of survival, treating certain death as evidence of superior moral commitment rather than tactical failure. The mathematical impossibility of success was being reframed as proof that only the Imperial Fists possessed sufficient dedication to attempt the impossible. Dorn's tactical brilliance was being systematically turned against him. Yet rather than retreat, the Imperial Fists began implementing strategies that could only be described as organized suicide. Rogal Dorn's personal response to the Iron Cage challenge revealed the depth of his psychological transformation since the breach of the Imperial Palace. Where once he had been capable of rational tactical analysis that prioritized Imperial interests over personal pride, he now showed signs of obsessive thinking that treated the Iron Cage as a personal insult that demanded absolute retaliation regardless of cost. The Praetorian's tactical logs from this period show a progressive deterioration in his strategic thinking that paralleled his increasing fixation on the Iron Cage. Rather than analyzing the fortress as a military problem to be solved through appropriate allocation of resources, Dorn began treating it as a philosophical challenge that would determine the fundamental validity of Imperial Fist defensive doctrine. His orders to Imperial Fist commanders reflected this psychological shift, Instead of seeking to minimize casualties while achieving tactical objectives, Dorn began issuing directives that prioritized demonstration of Imperial Fist capabilities over practical military effectiveness. Companies were ordered to maintain positions that served no strategic purpose, conduct assaults that offered no tactical advantage, and accept casualties that exceeded any reasonable strategic calculation. Most revealing of all was Dorn's response to subordinate officers who questioned the tactical wisdom of continued assault against the Iron Cage. Rather than engaging with their concerns through rational military analysis, he treated their questions as evidence of insufficient commitment to Imperial Fist principles. Officers who suggested alternative approaches were reassigned to punishment duties, while those who volunteered for the most dangerous missions were promoted regardless of their tactical competence. The point of no return came when both Primarchs realized that victory was no longer about tactical objectives. It had become about proving which legion's philosophy could endure absolute devastation. The moment when the Iron Cage engagement transcended normal military parameters occurred during what Imperial records euphemistically describe as the Doctrine Clarification Conference. Dorn and Perturabo, communicating through intermediaries and coded transmissions, had reached a mutual understanding that the Iron Cage represented something far more significant than a routine siege operation. Both Primarchs acknowledged that the engagement had evolved beyond tactical objectives into a test of fundamental principles that would determine the philosophical validity of their respective approaches to warfare. The Iron Cage was no longer a fortress to be taken or held. It was a laboratory where the ultimate questions about the nature of space marine warfare would be answered through practical demonstration. This realization should have prompted both sides to step back from the brink and return to rational strategic thinking. Instead, it had the opposite effect, intensifying their commitment to pursuing the engagement to its ultimate conclusion regardless of cost. Both legions began mobilizing resources on a scale that exceeded the fortress's strategic value by several orders of magnitude. The Iron Warriors reinforced the Iron Cage with defensive systems that incorporated technologies drawn from the darkest corners of chaos innovation. Daemon engines were integrated into the fortress walls, creating defensive positions that existed partially outside normal spacetime. Automated weapon systems were programmed with targeting algorithms that drew upon demonic intelligence to predict Imperial Fist tactical responses with supernatural accuracy. The Imperial Fists responded by committing not just their own forces, but calling upon resources from across the Imperium that should have been allocated to more strategically significant operations. Successor chapters were ordered to contribute companies to the assault. Imperial Guard regiments were reassigned from critical defensive positions, and naval assets were diverted from fleet operations that protected vital supply lines. Both sides were demonstrating a commitment to the Iron Cage engagement that exceeded rational strategic calculation. Driven by motivations that transcended normal military objectives, they were no longer fighting for territory, resources, or strategic advantage. They were fighting for the right to claim that their approach to warfare represented the ultimate truth about the nature of military conflict. The mathematical precision with which both sides calculated their resource allocation suggested that they were treating the Iron Cage as the final examination that would determine which legion deserved to be considered the Emperor's ultimate expression of transhuman military capability. Every decision was being measured against theoretical frameworks that prioritized philosophical validation over practical effectiveness. The stage was set for a confrontation that would push both forces beyond the boundaries of military rationality into a realm where victory and defeat became indistinguishable from mutual annihilation. The Iron Cage had become more than a fortress. It was the arena where two competing visions of what it meant to be a space marine would fight to the death, regardless of whether either vision deserved to survive the encounter. As the siege of the Iron Cage entered its most critical phase, both legions began implementing tactical innovations that exceeded not only established military doctrine, but the fundamental principles that had defined space marine warfare since the Great Crusade. What emerged from their desperation was not improved combat effectiveness, but a systematic abandonment of everything that had made them the Emperor's greatest warriors in favor of increasingly extreme demonstrations of their philosophical commitments. The Imperial Fists' response to the mathematical impossibility of breaching the Iron Cage was to abandon every principle of tactical rationality that had once defined their approach to siege warfare. Rogal Dorn issued orders that explicitly prohibited his forces from conducting preliminary reconnaissance, establishing supply lines, or implementing fallback positions that might suggest the possibility of strategic withdrawal. The Imperial Fists would assault the Iron Cage using methods that guaranteed maximum casualties while offering minimal probability of success. The innovations both sides developed exceeded all expectations, but at a cost that would have horrified the Emperor himself. They were learning to weaponize their own destruction. The tactical doctrine that emerged from these desperate circumstances represented a complete inversion of everything the Imperial Fists had learned about effective siege warfare. Rather than seeking to minimize casualties while maximizing tactical effectiveness, they began implementing assault strategies that treated casualties as evidence of superior moral commitment. Companies were ordered to advance across open ground under concentrated fire, using their own bodies as mobile cover for specialized breaching teams that had no realistic probability of reaching their objectives. When the first wave was decimated, they sent a second. When the second was destroyed, they deployed a third. The mathematical impossibility of success was being reframed as proof that only the Imperial Fists possessed sufficient dedication to attempt what lesser forces would consider tactically insane. Each failed assault was treated not as evidence that alternative approaches should be considered, but as justification for even more extreme demonstrations of commitment. The weapon innovations developed during this period pushed the boundaries of what was possible within the constraints of Imperial technology. Imperial Fist tech marines began constructing siege engines that prioritized symbolic significance over tactical effectiveness. Massive battering rams that could only be operated by battle brothers who accepted certain death, assault vehicles that offered no protection for their crews, and breaching charges that required manual detonation by warriors who had no possibility of survival. These innovations represented a fundamental shift in how the Imperial Fists understood the relationship between technology and warfare. Where once they had used tools to extend their capabilities and improve their effectiveness, they now created instruments that transformed military operations into ritualized demonstrations of their willingness to die for abstract principles. More disturbing still were the psychological conditioning innovations that allowed Imperial Fist warriors to function effectively while implementing tactics that any rational analysis would classify as organized suicide. Pain amplification devices were incorporated into their armor systems, creating feedback loops that associated tactical success with increased suffering. Battle brothers were conditioned to interpret survival as evidence of insufficient commitment to their duties. The training regimens developed during this period exceeded anything that had been implemented during the Great Crusade. Neophytes were subjected to conditioning programs that systematically eliminated survival instincts, tactical flexibility, and independent thinking in favor of absolute obedience to doctrinal requirements. The Imperial Fists were creating warriors who would literally fight until their bodies failed rather than accept strategic withdrawal under any circumstances. When veteran sergeants began questioning orders that amounted to organized suicide, both Primarchs gave the same response. Sometimes victory requires the complete destruction of everything you're trying to protect. The Iron Warriors' innovations proved even more extreme in their systematic abandonment of rational military thinking. Perturabo's response to Imperial Fist tactical desperation was to modify the Iron Cage's defensive systems to maximize the psychological impact of each Imperial Fist casualty, rather than simply preventing successful assault. The fortress was transformed from a defensive installation into an elaborate execution device designed to demonstrate the futility of Imperial Fist tactical doctrine. Automated weapon systems were reprogrammed to wound rather than kill attacking Imperial Fists, creating casualties that would require rescue operations that exposed additional battle brothers to defensive fire. Medical facilities within the fortress were converted into broadcast stations that transmitted the screams of wounded Imperial Fists across all communication frequencies, creating psychological warfare effects that exceeded anything attempted during the Horus Heresy. The siege engines constructed by the Iron Warriors during this period incorporated technologies that existed at the intersection of mechanical engineering and daemonic possession. Weapons were created that drew their power from the suffering of their targets rather than conventional ammunition, creating feedback loops that made them more effective the more damage they inflicted. Defensive positions were reinforced with materials that existed partially in the warp, making them immune to conventional weapons while allowing them to strike back through methods that defied physical laws. Perhaps most terrifying of all were the mathematical models that Perturabo developed to calculate optimal casualty rates for maximum psychological impact. The Iron Warriors began implementing defensive strategies that were designed not to prevent Imperial Fist success, but to ensure that any tactical gains were achieved at precisely calculated costs that would break Imperial Fist morale through accumulated trauma. These innovations required the Iron Warriors to abandon fundamental principles about the relationship between military efficiency and tactical effectiveness. Where once they had sought to achieve objectives through minimal expenditure of resources, they now created systems that deliberately consumed their own resources in order to maximize enemy suffering. The mathematical precision that had once made them the galaxy's premier siege specialists was being perverted into algorithms for systematic torture. The organizational changes required to implement these innovations pushed both legions beyond the boundaries of normal military structure into something that resembled competing death cults. Command hierarchies were modified to eliminate officers who showed signs of rational tactical thinking in favor of leaders who demonstrated absolute commitment to doctrinal purity regardless of practical consequences. The moment came when both legions crossed a line that even the Chaos Gods had never demanded. They began to worship their own annihilation as the highest form of warfare. The psychological transformation that allowed both legions to function while implementing these innovations represented something unprecedented in the history of Space Marine warfare. They had developed belief systems that treated mutual destruction as the ultimate validation of their respective approaches to military conflict. Success was no longer measured by tactical achievements or strategic objectives, but by the intensity of suffering that each side could endure while maintaining their doctrinal commitments. Imperial Fist battle brothers began describing their service in terms that resembled religious devotion to the concept of perfect martyrdom. They spoke of each assault against the Iron Cage as an opportunity to demonstrate their worthiness through acceptance of impossible odds and inevitable death. Survival was treated as evidence of insufficient commitment rather than tactical success. Iron Warriors developed parallel belief systems that treated siege warfare as a form of mathematical worship that demonstrated the superiority of analytical thinking over all other approaches to problem solving. They described their defensive operations as opportunities to prove that rational analysis could overcome any enemy regardless of their courage, determination, or moral commitment. Both legions had essentially created religions based on their military specializations, with theological frameworks that demanded continuous escalation toward increasingly extreme demonstrations of faith. The Iron Cage had become their shared cathedral, a place where both sides could worship their respective visions of ultimate warfare through mutual destruction. The innovations they developed during this period were not military improvements, but sacramental practices that transformed routine combat operations into ritualized demonstrations of philosophical superiority. Every tactical decision was evaluated not for its practical effectiveness, but for its theological significance within their competing frameworks of belief. The point of no return was reached when both legions acknowledged that they could no longer function as normal military units. They had become something entirely new, transhuman war cults that existed solely to validate their own approaches to conflict through increasingly elaborate demonstrations of their willingness to die for abstract principles. The Emperor's greatest warriors had transformed themselves into the galaxy's most sophisticated suicide machines, and they were about to prove their dedication by activating those machines against each other. The moment of ultimate revelation came not through tactical analysis or battlefield intelligence, but through a series of intercepted communications that revealed the true scope of what both Primarchs had planned for their legions. The Iron Cage was never intended to be a military engagement that one side would win and the other would lose. It was a carefully orchestrated mutual suicide pact disguised as the ultimate test of competing military philosophies. Both Dorn and Perturabo had independently reached the same conclusion: their legion's rivalry could only be resolved through the complete destruction of both forces. The intelligence breakthrough occurred when Mechanicum adepts analyzing warp communication patterns detected synchronized transmissions between the Iron Cage and Terra that suggested coordination between theoretically opposed forces. The mathematical precision of these communications indicated that both Primarchs were operating according to predetermined protocols that had been established before the siege began. What appeared to be a desperate military engagement was actually a scripted performance designed to achieve predetermined casualty targets. The trusted battle brothers who had fought alongside each other for centuries were now forced to choose between survival and the madness their Primarchs called honor, Captain Lysander's discovery of sealed orders within the Imperial Fist command structure revealed the true scope of Dorn's betrayal of his own legion. The Praetorian had issued classified directives that explicitly prohibited Imperial Fist forces from implementing tactical innovations that might improve their chances of survival. Supply requests for additional ammunition were to be denied, medical evacuation procedures were to be suspended, and communications with external Imperial forces were to be severed once the final assault began. These orders were accompanied by theological justifications that treated the Iron Cage engagement as a form of ritual purification that would prove the Imperial Fists worthy of their role as the Emperor's chosen defenders. Dorn had concluded that his legion's failure to prevent the breach of the Imperial Palace demonstrated fundamental flaws in their character that could only be corrected through absolute sacrifice. The Iron Cage was not a fortress to be conquered. It was an altar upon which the Imperial Fists would demonstrate their worthiness through voluntary martyrdom. The psychological conditioning that had prepared Imperial Fist warriors for this moment became clear in retrospect. Every pain glove session had been designed to eliminate survival instincts that might interfere with their willingness to die on command. Every tactical exercise had been structured to reinforce the belief that death in service of doctrine was superior to life achieved through compromise. The Imperial Fists had been systematically conditioned to view their own destruction as the ultimate expression of loyalty. Veteran sergeants, who had begun to question the tactical wisdom of continued assault, found themselves confronting orders that explicitly prohibited tactical adaptation or strategic thinking. They were required to implement assault strategies that guaranteed failure while treating any suggestion of alternative approaches as evidence of corruption that justified immediate execution. The Legion's command structure had been modified to eliminate independent thinking in favor of absolute obedience to suicidal orders. Meanwhile, intercepted Iron Warriors communications revealed that Perturabo had implemented parallel preparations for the systematic destruction of his own forces. The Iron Cage's defensive systems had been designed not simply to repel Imperial Fist attacks, but to ensure that Iron Warriors' casualties reached predetermined levels that would validate his theories about the mathematical relationship between tactical superiority and acceptable losses. The shocking discovery that challenged everything they believed about duty and loyalty was this: their own Primarchs had become the greatest enemies their legions would ever face. Perturabo's true motivations became clear through analysis of his theoretical writings discovered in abandoned Iron Warriors' strongholds. The Iron Warriors Primarch had become obsessed with proving that his analytical approach to warfare was superior to emotional concepts like loyalty, brotherhood, or survival. The Iron Cage represented the ultimate test of this theory, when a scenario where mathematical precision would demonstrate its superiority by destroying the very forces that had created it. The Iron Warriors were not defending the Iron Cage to achieve tactical victory. They were implementing defensive strategies designed to prove that rational analysis could overcome any enemy, including their own survival instincts. Perturabo had calculated that the systematic destruction of both legions would validate his theories about the superiority of mathematical thinking over all other approaches to military conflict. The defensive innovations incorporated into the Iron Cage included systems that were specifically designed to maximize Iron Warriors' casualties while maintaining the appearance of tactical effectiveness. Automated weapon systems would malfunction at predetermined intervals, creating opportunities for Imperial Fist breakthrough that would require Iron Warriors to expose themselves to defensive fire. Medical facilities within the fortress were equipped with devices that would ensure wounded Iron Warriors died from their injuries rather than recovering to fight again. Most damning of all was the discovery of Perturabo's communications with chaos entities that revealed his true objectives. The Iron Warriors Primarch had made agreements with demonic forces that would guarantee his personal survival while ensuring the complete destruction of his legion. He viewed the Iron Warriors as expendable resources that could be sacrificed to prove the theoretical superiority of his analytical methods. The Iron Warriors' command structure had been modified to eliminate officers who might question orders that prioritized theoretical validation over practical survival. Battle Brothers were conditioned to interpret survival as evidence of insufficient commitment to Perturabo's vision of perfect warfare. The Legion had been transformed into a collection of expendable test subjects for their Primarchs' philosophical experiments. Both legions discovered that they had been betrayed not by external enemies, but by the very leaders they had sworn to follow unto death. The loyalty that defined their existence as Space Marines had been perverted into a weapon that their own Primarchs were using to destroy them. They faced a choice that no Space Marine had ever been forced to confront, whether to die for leaders who had already condemned them, or to save themselves by abandoning everything that made them who they were. When the full scale of the betrayal became apparent, both legions faced a choice that no Space Marine had ever confronted, whether to die for Primarchs who had already condemned them, or to save themselves by abandoning everything that made them who they were. The revelation of their Primarchs' true intentions created a psychological crisis that exceeded anything either legion had experienced during the Horus Heresy. Space Marines were conditioned to follow orders without question, to trust their leaders absolutely, and to view loyalty as the highest virtue. The discovery that their own Primarchs had systematically betrayed these principles challenged the fundamental assumptions that defined their existence. Imperial Fist companies began experiencing breakdown of unit cohesion as battle brothers struggled to reconcile their conditioning with the evidence of Dorn's betrayal. Veterans who had served for centuries found themselves questioning orders for the first time in their existence, while neophytes who had been conditioned to view independent thinking as corruption began showing signs of psychological trauma that exceeded battlefield stress. The command structure modifications that both Primarchs had implemented to ensure compliance with suicidal orders began to break down as officers were forced to choose between loyalty to their Primarchs and loyalty to their battle brothers. Captains who had previously followed orders without question began refusing to implement tactical strategies that served no purpose beyond maximizing casualties. Iron Warriors units experienced similar psychological breakdown as they confronted the reality that their analytical precision had been perverted into a tool for their own destruction. Warriors who had prided themselves on rational thinking found themselves implementing defensive strategies that prioritized theoretical validation over practical survival. The mathematical models that had once made them the galaxy's premier siege specialists had been corrupted into algorithms for systematic suicide. Both legions faced the terrible realization that their greatest virtues, loyalty, dedication, and unwillingness to accept defeat, had been turned against them by the very leaders who had cultivated these traits. They were trapped in a psychological prison constructed from their own conditioning, forced to choose between betraying their fundamental nature or accepting systematic destruction. The breakdown of legion discipline that followed these revelations created opportunities for survival that neither Primarch had anticipated. Small groups of battle brothers from both sides began implementing unauthorized tactical innovations designed to minimize casualties rather than maximize doctrinal demonstration. Unauthorized communications were established between Imperial Fist and Iron Warriors units that allowed them to coordinate withdrawal from the most suicidal assault positions. These acts of rebellion against their own Primarchs represented something unprecedented in Space Marine history: the recognition that loyalty to abstract principles might be less important than loyalty to the battle brothers who shared those principles. Both legions were discovering that their true identity lay not in obedience to authority, but in their commitment to each other and to the survival of everything they had built together. The psychological transformation required to break free from their conditioning demanded that both legions acknowledge that their Primarchs had become corrupted by the very obsessions that had once made them great. This recognition opened the possibility for a different kind of resolution to their rivalry, one based on mutual survival rather than mutual destruction. But whether they could overcome centuries of conditioning in time to save themselves remained to be seen as the final phase of the Iron Cage approached its terrible conclusion. The breakdown of legion discipline and command authority that followed the revelation of their Primarch's betrayal created a cascade of systemic failures that transformed the Iron Cage from an organized military engagement into something resembling a massive psychological experiment gone catastrophically wrong. As both forces struggled to maintain operational effectiveness while questioning the fundamental assumptions that had defined their existence, the careful choreography of mutual destruction began to collapse into genuine chaos. The infrastructure that had sustained both legions through months of siege warfare began to fail as officers and battle brothers prioritized survival over doctrinal compliance. Supply lines that had been maintained through disciplined adherence to established protocols broke down when logistics personnel began questioning orders that seemed designed to ensure their units' destruction. Communication networks that had coordinated tactical operations according to predetermined plans devolved into unauthorized exchanges between units seeking alternatives to suicide missions. The cascading effects of their choices were making the situation exponentially worse, but rather than retreat, both legions began competing to see who could embrace destruction more completely. The Imperial Fists command structure, built around the principle of absolute obedience to superior authority, proved particularly vulnerable to the psychological shock of recognizing their Primarch's betrayal. Companies that had functioned with mechanical precision for centuries began experiencing paralysis as officers struggled to determine which orders represented legitimate tactical requirements and which were designed to maximize casualties for theoretical purposes. Captain Maximus Thane's attempts to maintain unit cohesion while protecting his battle brothers from obviously suicidal orders created conflicts that spread throughout the Imperial Fist hierarchy. Veterans who had never questioned orders began refusing assignments that offered no tactical value, while neophytes who had been conditioned to view independent thinking as corruption began showing signs of psychological breakdown as they confronted evidence that their conditioning had been designed to facilitate their destruction. The tactical innovations that individual Imperial Fist units began implementing to improve their survival prospects often conflicted with the doctrinal requirements that other units were still attempting to follow. This created situations where Imperial Fist forces were inadvertently working against each other, with some companies implementing rational tactical strategies while others continued to follow suicidal assault protocols. The breakdown was intensified by the discovery that many of the tactical manuals and conditioning protocols that had defined Imperial Fist doctrine had been systematically modified to eliminate survival instincts and tactical flexibility. Battle Brothers found themselves confronting the realization that much of what they had believed about proper military conduct was actually psychological manipulation designed to make them easier to sacrifice. The medical facilities that should have been treating wounded Imperial Fists were overwhelmed not just by battlefield casualties, but by psychological trauma cases as warriors struggled to reconcile their fundamental beliefs with evidence of systematic betrayal. Apothecaries reported unprecedented numbers of battle brothers experiencing what could only be described as existential crisis as they questioned everything they had been taught about duty, loyalty, and honor. As veteran Space Marines watched centuries of brotherhood dissolve into competing death cults, they faced the terrible realization that they were witnessing the birth of something that transcended both loyalty and rebellion. The Iron Warriors experienced their own version of systemic collapse, as their analytical precision was revealed to be a sophisticated form of self-deception that had hidden the true purpose of their methods. Units that had prided themselves on rational tactical thinking found themselves implementing defensive strategies that prioritized theoretical validation over practical effectiveness, creating internal conflicts between their conditioning and their survival instincts. The mathematical models that had guided Iron Warriors' decision-making for decades were revealed to contain hidden variables that had been manipulated to ensure predetermined outcomes rather than optimal tactical solutions. Battle Brothers, who had believed they were implementing superior analytical methods, discovered that they had actually been following algorithms designed to guarantee their eventual destruction. Warband leaders who attempted to modify their tactics to improve survival prospects found themselves conflicting with other Iron Warriors units that were still following Perturabo's original directives. This created situations where Iron Warriors forces were inadvertently sabotaging each other's defensive positions while attempting to prove the superiority of different theoretical approaches to siege warfare. The technological systems that had given the Iron Warriors their edge in siege warfare began to malfunction as their operators questioned the true purpose of weapons that seemed designed to consume their own forces as efficiently as they destroyed enemies. Daemon engines incorporated into the fortress's defensive systems began targeting Iron Warriors' positions when their programming detected deviation from predetermined casualty parameters. Most disturbing of all was the recognition that the analytical precision that had defined Iron Warriors' culture was itself a form of psychological conditioning that had eliminated their ability to question the fundamental assumptions underlying their methods. They had been trained to view mathematical analysis as the ultimate form of truth, making them incapable of recognizing when that analysis had been corrupted to serve purposes that contradicted their survival. The survivors of both legions now faced a choice that would determine the fate of every Space Marine who came after, whether to die as heroes in a meaningless slaughter, or live as something entirely new in a galaxy that no longer had room for their kind of absolute loyalty. The breakdown of traditional Legion structure created opportunities for unprecedented cooperation between Imperial Fist and Iron Warriors units that had been conditioned to view each other as eternal enemies. Small groups of battle brothers from both sides began implementing unauthorized truces that allowed them to share intelligence about their Primarchs' true objectives and coordinate efforts to survive the systematic destruction that had been planned for them. These acts of cooperation required both sides to abandon fundamental assumptions about the nature of loyalty and duty that had defined their existence as Space Marines. Imperial Fists had to acknowledge that their commitment to defensive doctrine had been perverted into a tool for their own destruction. Iron Warriors had to recognize that their analytical precision had been corrupted into a method for systematic suicide disguised as tactical superiority. The psychological transformation required to break free from their conditioning was made more difficult by the fact that both legions had been shaped by their rivalry with each other. Their identities were so thoroughly defined in opposition to their counterparts that cooperation required them to fundamentally reconceive what it meant to be Imperial Fists or Iron Warriors. The technological systems that both sides had developed to support their specialized approaches to warfare began to be turned toward different purposes as battle brothers sought ways to survive rather than demonstrate doctrinal superiority. Imperial Fist defensive positions were modified to provide actual protection rather than opportunities for heroic sacrifice. Iron Warriors' siege engines were repurposed to create escape routes rather than optimize casualty rates. The command structures that had maintained Legion discipline began to be replaced by ad hoc organizations based on mutual survival rather than hierarchical authority. Veterans from both sides found themselves leading mixed units that combined Imperial Fist defensive expertise with Iron Warriors' analytical precision, creating tactical capabilities that exceeded what either legion could achieve independently. The psychological conditioning that had made both legions vulnerable to their Primarchs' manipulation began to be systematically dismantled as battle brothers shared their experiences and recognized the common patterns in their indoctrination. They discovered that much of what they had believed about their respective superiority was actually carefully constructed prejudice designed to prevent cooperation that might threaten their Primarchs' control. The realization that their greatest enemies were not each other, but the obsessions that had consumed their leaders, created possibilities for resolution that transcended the traditional boundaries of loyalty and rebellion. Both legions began to understand that their survival required not the victory of one philosophy over another, but the recognition that both approaches to warfare had been corrupted by extremism that served no purpose beyond the satisfaction of pride. Yet even as this recognition emerged, the momentum of months of preparation for mutual destruction proved difficult to overcome. Both Primarchs had committed too much to their respective visions of ultimate warfare to accept any resolution that did not validate their theoretical frameworks through practical demonstration. The final phase of the Iron Cage would determine whether the battle brothers' newfound understanding could overcome the psychological momentum that was driving both legions toward annihilation. The climactic assault on the Iron Cage's central citadel began not with the disciplined precision that had once characterized both legions, but with the desperate fury of warriors who had finally understood that they were fighting not for victory, but for the right to define what it meant to survive when survival itself had been redefined as betrayal. The mathematical choreography that Perturabo had designed for this moment, the tactical perfection that Dorn had envisioned for his legion's ultimate test, dissolved into something far more primal and infinitely more tragic. The final Imperial Fist assault force consisted of volunteers from across the legion, who had made a conscious choice to abandon their conditioning in favor of tactical approaches designed to achieve actual objectives rather than demonstrate doctrinal purity. Led by Captain Maximus Thane, these battle brothers implemented siege techniques that incorporated innovations borrowed from Iron Warriors' methodology, creating hybrid tactics that neither Primarch had anticipated or prepared for. As the final assault began, it became clear that this wasn't a battle for victory. It was a ritual sacrifice of everything Space Marines had ever claimed to represent. The approach to the Citadel required Imperial Fist forces to advance through killing fields that had been designed according to mathematical models of their own tactical doctrine. Every piece of cover, every avenue of approach, every potential breach point had been calculated to funnel attacking forces into predetermined casualty zones where they could be systematically destroyed. Yet the battle brothers who advanced through these nightmare corridors were no longer following the doctrinal requirements that had shaped those calculations. The hybrid tactics developed through unauthorized cooperation between Imperial Fist and Iron Warrior survivors created confusion in the fortress's automated defensive systems. Weapons that had been programmed to target specific behavioral patterns found themselves engaging forces that moved according to analytical principles while maintaining defensive formations that prioritized survival over doctrinal demonstration. The mathematical perfection of Perturabo's trap began to break down when confronted by tactics that existed outside his theoretical framework. The Citadel's interior defenses revealed the true scope of both Primarchs' obsession with proving their respective philosophies through practical demonstration. Room by room fighting through chambers that had been designed to recreate every significant Imperial Fist defensive position from their historical campaigns, forcing attackers to breach fortifications that looked exactly like structures they had once defended. The psychological impact was devastating, creating cognitive dissonance that interfered with tactical thinking and decision-making processes. Iron Warriors defenders found themselves implementing defensive strategies that had been specifically designed to maximize their own casualties while demonstrating the theoretical superiority of their analytical methods. Defensive positions were abandoned according to predetermined schedules rather than tactical necessity, creating opportunities for Imperial Fist advancement that served no purpose beyond validating mathematical models about acceptable loss ratios. The fighting devolved into something that resembled ritualized combat more than military engagement, with both sides implementing tactical innovations that prioritized symbolic significance over practical effectiveness. Imperial Fist assault teams used weapons that required manual detonation by warriors who had no possibility of survival. Iron Warriors' defensive positions were equipped with automated systems that would eliminate their own operators once predetermined casualty thresholds had been reached. The critical moment that changed everything came not from either legion's tactical brilliance, but from an outside force that refused to let the Imperium's greatest defenders destroy each other for pride. The intervention that finally broke the cycle of mutual destruction came from an unexpected source, who had been monitoring the Iron Cage engagement from a distance while attempting to understand what had driven two of the Emperor's most disciplined legions to the brink of systematic suicide. Guilliman's arrival with a full battle company represented the first rational military force to enter the engagement since it had begun. The Ultramarines' assessment of the tactical situation was devastating in its clarity. Both the Imperial Fists and Iron Warriors had abandoned every principle of effective military conduct in favor of increasingly elaborate demonstrations of their willingness to die for abstract theoretical frameworks. The engagement served no strategic purpose, achieved no tactical objectives, and consumed resources that were desperately needed for the Imperium's actual military requirements. Guilliman's personal confrontation with both Dorn and Perturabo during the height of the Citadel assault forced both Primarchs to articulate their objectives in terms that revealed the complete irrationality of their positions. Neither could explain how the mutual destruction of their legions would serve Imperial interests, demonstrate tactical superiority, or achieve any goal beyond the satisfaction of personal pride. The Ultramarines' intervention created tactical opportunities that had not existed while the engagement remained a closed system between Imperial Fists and Iron Warriors. External medical support allowed wounded battle brothers from both sides to receive treatment that prioritized survival over doctrinal purity. Communication networks that had been severed to prevent unauthorized cooperation were restored, allowing rational coordination between units that had been forced to operate in isolation. Most significantly, Guilliman's presence provided both legions with an external perspective that revealed the true scope of their psychological manipulation. The Ultramarines had maintained rational military thinking throughout the post-Heresy period, demonstrating that it was possible for Space Marines to function effectively without embracing extremist interpretations of their respective specializations. The choice between continuing the slaughter or accepting shame became unavoidable when external Imperial forces made it clear that they would not permit the systematic destruction of two premier legions for the satisfaction of personal rivalry. Both Primarchs were forced to confront the reality that their obsession with proving theoretical superiority had become more important to them than the survival of the warriors they claimed to lead. Recognition that the galaxy needed both legions more than they needed revenge created pressure for resolution that transcended the psychological momentum driving both forces toward mutual annihilation. The broader strategic situation facing the Imperium made it impossible to justify the consumption of irreplaceable military assets for purely symbolic purposes. The end came not through tactical brilliance or strategic innovation, but through mutual exhaustion that bordered on mutual annihilation. The final hours of the Iron Cage engagement, were characterized by a gradual recognition among battle brothers from both sides that they had participated in something that transcended normal military operations and entered the realm of shared madness. The mathematical precision with which both Primarchs had calculated acceptable casualty rates, the psychological conditioning that had prepared both legions for systematic self-destruction, and the theoretical frameworks that had justified mutual annihilation were revealed as sophisticated forms of delusion that had nearly consumed everything they had been created to protect. The casualties sustained during the final assault exceeded the worst battles of the Horus Heresy in terms of their proportion to forces engaged. Entire companies from both legions had been reduced to a handful of survivors, yet both sides continued fighting with an intensity that suggested they had found meaning in the destruction itself rather than in any tactical objectives they hoped to achieve. The breakthrough that finally ended the engagement came when surviving Imperial Fist and Iron Warriors battle brothers began implementing coordinated withdrawal procedures that prioritized mutual survival over doctrinal demonstration. These unauthorized tactical innovations required both sides to abandon fundamental assumptions about their relationship with each other and recognize that their rivalry had been manipulated by their own leaders for purposes that served neither legion's actual interests. The immediate aftermath revealed the true cost of both Primarchs' obsession with theoretical validation. The Imperial Fists had been reduced to a fraction of their original strength, with survivors showing psychological trauma that exceeded anything documented in Space Marine medical literature. The Iron Warriors had suffered comparable losses while proving nothing beyond their ability to engineer their own destruction with mathematical precision. Both Primarchs' reactions to the forced disengagement revealed the depth of their psychological deterioration. Rather than acknowledging the human cost of their rivalry, both Dorn and Perturabo continued to insist that their respective approaches to warfare had been validated through practical demonstration. They seemed incapable of recognizing that proving the superiority of their methods through mutual destruction was a logical contradiction that served no purpose beyond personal satisfaction. The final moments of the Iron Cage would echo through the millennia, not because of who won or lost, but because they proved that even the Emperor's greatest creations could be broken by their own virtues turned against them. The resolution of the Iron Cage engagement came through external intervention rather than internal victory, creating a precedent that would influence Imperial military doctrine for millennia. The recognition that even the most disciplined Space Marine legions could be driven to self-destructive extremism through psychological manipulation established the need for external oversight that could prevent similar incidents in the future. The immediate military consequences were devastating for both forces. The Imperial Fists were forced to implement the Last Wall Protocol, breaking their legion structure into smaller successor chapters that could never again accumulate sufficient concentrated power to attempt such systematic self-destruction. The Iron Warriors, already committed to chaos, embraced their losses as evidence that loyalty itself was a form of weakness that needed to be purged through absolute dedication to destruction as an end in itself. The psychological aftermath proved even more significant than the immediate military consequences. Both legions had demonstrated that Space Marine conditioning could be perverted to serve purposes that contradicted the fundamental objectives of the Imperial military. This recognition forced comprehensive revision of recruitment practices, training protocols, and command structures across all Space Marine formations. The Iron Cage had proven that the greatest threat to Space Marine effectiveness was not external enemies or chaos corruption, but the potential for their own virtues to be turned into weapons of self-destruction. The lesson would be remembered, studied, and occasionally ignored by future generations of Imperial commanders, who believed they could avoid the psychological traps that had consumed two of the Emperor's greatest legions. The silence that followed the forced cessation of hostilities at the Iron Cage was unlike anything in the recorded history of Space Marine warfare. It was not the quiet of victory or the exhaustion of defeat, but the stunned recognition of survivors who had participated in something that exceeded the boundaries of rational military conduct and entered territory that had no name in Imperial tactical doctrine. Both legions found themselves confronting the immediate practical consequences of months spent pursuing theoretical validation through mutual destruction. The casualty assessment that followed the disengagement revealed losses that challenged fundamental assumptions about Space Marine resilience and operational sustainability. The Imperial Fists had suffered casualties approaching 80% of their engaged forces, with surviving battle brothers showing signs of psychological trauma that exceeded anything documented in their medical archives. The Iron Warriors had sustained comparable losses while achieving tactical objectives that served no strategic purpose beyond demonstrating their analytical capabilities under extreme conditions. The most disturbing discovery was that both Legion survivors seemed to consider their near annihilation a form of victory, suggesting the psychological damage went far deeper than anyone had realized. Captain Maximus Thane's initial reports to Terra described survivors who showed difficulty readjusting to military operations that did not involve systematic self-destruction. Imperial Fist battle brothers, who had been conditioned to view survival as evidence of insufficient commitment, required extensive psychological reconditioning before they could function effectively in normal tactical situations. Many showed symptoms that resembled addiction withdrawal when separated from the extreme stress conditions that had characterized the Iron Cage engagement. The medical facilities established to treat Iron Cage survivors were overwhelmed not just by physical casualties, but by psychological cases that had no precedent in Space Marine medical literature. Battle brothers from both sides exhibited trauma responses that suggested they had experienced something that exceeded the normal parameters of combat stress and entered territory that resembled systematic torture disguised as military training. The attempt to conduct standard after-action reviews revealed that many survivors were incapable of describing their experiences in terms that corresponded to normal military analysis. They spoke of the Iron Cage engagement in language that resembled religious testimony more than tactical reporting, describing their participation as a form of transcendent experience that had revealed fundamental truths about the nature of warfare and loyalty. Imperial Fist survivors showed particular difficulty reintegrating with normal Legion operations that emphasized tactical effectiveness over doctrinal demonstration. Veterans who had once functioned with mechanical precision began showing signs of psychological paralysis when confronted with tactical situations that offered genuine opportunities for success without requiring extreme sacrifice. Iron Warriors survivors exhibited parallel symptoms, showing inability to implement siege techniques that prioritized efficiency over analytical complexity. Warriors who had once approached fortress breaking as applied mathematics began showing obsessive behaviors that suggested they could only find meaning in tactical problems that offered opportunities for systematic self-destruction. As Imperial authorities tried to understand what had happened, they made a terrifying discovery. The Iron Cage had proven that the Imperium's greatest defenders could be their own worst enemies. The broader implications of the Iron Cage became apparent as Imperial intelligence services attempted to understand how two premier legions had been reduced to mutual suicide cults without external chaos corruption or obvious military coercion. The analysis revealed systemic vulnerabilities in Space Marine psychological conditioning that had been exploited not by external enemies but by the Legion's own leadership pursuing theoretical objectives that served no practical military purpose. The discovery that Primarch-level authority could be used to implement systematic psychological manipulation that turned Legion virtues into tools of self-destruction forced comprehensive revision of Imperial military doctrine. Command structures were modified to include external oversight mechanisms designed to identify and prevent similar psychological manipulation in the future. The tactical innovations developed during the Iron Cage engagement were classified at the highest levels of Imperial security, not because they offered military advantages, but because they demonstrated methods for weaponizing loyalty that posed existential threats to Imperial military effectiveness. The techniques for turning defensive doctrine into systematic martyrdom and analytical precision into organized suicide were considered too dangerous for general military knowledge. The psychological conditioning methods that had enabled both legions to function while implementing obviously self-destructive tactics were banned across all Imperial military formations. Training protocols that eliminated survival instincts, discouraged independent thinking, or treated casualties as measures of success were identified as security threats that could be exploited by enemies seeking to turn Imperial forces against themselves. The Iron Cage precedent established new protocols for managing Space Marine specialization that were designed to prevent the kind of extremist interpretation that had consumed both legions. Successor chapters were required to maintain tactical flexibility that would prevent them from becoming so focused on their particular specializations that they could be manipulated into self-destructive behaviors. The immediate political consequences were equally significant. The recognition that Primarch-level leadership could pose existential threats to their own forces forced reconsideration of the fundamental assumptions underlying Space Marine command structure. The balance between loyalty and independent judgment that had been considered settled doctrine since the Great Crusade was revealed to be far more complex than previous analysis had suggested. The consequences were only beginning to emerge, but already it was clear that the Iron Cage had changed the fundamental nature of what it meant to be a Space Marine, and not necessarily for the better. The logistical challenges of rebuilding two devastated legions while maintaining their operational effectiveness revealed the true scope of the damage that had been inflicted. Both forces required not just replacement personnel and equipment, but comprehensive psychological rehabilitation that could restore their ability to function as rational military units, rather than death cults pursuing theoretical validation through systematic self-destruction. The recruitment protocols established to replace Iron Cage casualties incorporated psychological screening measures designed to identify candidates who might be vulnerable to the kind of extremist conditioning that had enabled the systematic manipulation of both legions. The selection criteria for Space Marine candidates were modified to emphasize psychological resilience and independent thinking rather than absolute obedience to authority. The training methods developed to rehabilitate Iron Cage survivors became standard components of Space Marine psychological conditioning across all chapters. Battle Brothers were trained to recognize the warning signs of extremist interpretation of their doctrinal specializations, and to maintain tactical flexibility that would prevent them from becoming vulnerable to psychological manipulation. The Iron Cage engagement was incorporated into Space Marine tactical education as a cautionary example of how military virtues could be perverted into tools of self-destruction. The mathematical precision with which both Primarchs had calculated acceptable casualty rates was studied not as tactical innovation but as evidence of psychological pathology that required prevention rather than emulation. The broader implications for Imperial military culture extended beyond the Space Marines to affect all branches of Imperial service. The recognition that elite military units could be turned against themselves through psychological manipulation established new requirements for command oversight and tactical review that would prevent similar incidents across all Imperial forces. The Iron Cage had proven that in the grim darkness of the far future, the greatest threats to Imperial military effectiveness might come not from external enemies, but from the potential for Imperial virtues themselves to be weaponized against the forces that embodied them. This recognition would shape Imperial military doctrine for millennia, serving as a permanent reminder that even the Emperor's greatest warriors were vulnerable to corruption that came not from chaos, but from their own dedication turned to destructive purposes. The immediate aftermath of the Iron Cage left both legions forever changed, not just by their losses, but by the recognition that they had been willing participants in their own systematic destruction. This knowledge would haunt their successors for 10,000 years, serving as a constant reminder that the line between loyalty and madness was far thinner than anyone had ever imagined. The reverberations of the Iron Cage Massacre extended far beyond the immediate casualties and tactical lessons learned on Sebastus IV. In the 10 millennia that followed, the philosophical poison that had consumed both legions spread through the Imperium's military culture like a virus, creating institutional changes that would fundamentally alter how Space Marines understood their relationship to duty, sacrifice, and the meaning of victory itself. The Iron Cage became more than a historical event. It became a template for how Imperial forces would interpret the relationship between honor and self-destruction. The most immediate and visible consequence was the implementation of the Codex Astartes reforms that broke the Imperial Fists into smaller successor chapters. This division was officially justified as a tactical improvement that would prevent future concentration of power, but the classified records reveal a more disturbing motivation. The recognition that the Imperial Fists could no longer be trusted to operate as a unified force without external oversight to prevent their self-destructive tendencies. The influence of the Iron Cage proved indestructible, spreading through both Imperial and Chaos forces like a virus that turned strength into self-destruction. The Crimson Fists, as the most prominent Imperial Fist successor chapter, inherited not just the tactical doctrines of their parent legion, but the psychological conditioning that had made the Iron Cage possible. Their fortress monastery on Rin's world was constructed according to architectural principles that deliberately incorporated structural weaknesses, designed to test the defender's commitment to maintaining hopeless positions. The chapter's combat doctrine emphasized defensive strategies that prioritized demonstration of endurance over tactical effectiveness. The Black Templars took this evolution to its logical extreme. developing a crusading philosophy that treated systematic self-destruction as the highest form of imperial service. Their recruitment practices specifically sought out candidates who showed signs of the psychological profile that had enabled Iron Cage survivors to function while implementing obviously suicidal tactics. The chapter's entire organizational structure was designed around the assumption that true loyalty required the willingness to embrace certain death for abstract principles. The Imperial Fists themselves, reduced to a fraction of their original strength, became obsessed with proving that their near destruction had been a form of purification rather than catastrophic failure. Their fortress monastery was rebuilt to incorporate meditation chambers based on Dorn's pain glove designs, creating institutional mechanisms for systematic psychological conditioning that eliminated survival instincts in favor of absolute dedication to defensive doctrine. The technological innovations developed during the Iron Cage continued to influence Imperial military engineering for millennia. Defensive systems were designed to incorporate acceptable sacrifice parameters that calculated optimal casualty rates for maximum psychological impact on enemy forces. The mathematical models developed by both legions for determining when tactical objectives should be prioritized over survival became standard components of Imperial Guard tactical doctrine. Even 10 millennia later, the echoes of the Iron Cage continue to shape how the Imperium's defenders view the relationship between duty and survival. The Iron Warriors' complete transformation into Chaos Space Marines represented the other extreme of the Iron Cage's psychological legacy. Rather than viewing their near destruction as purification, they embraced it as evidence that loyalty itself was a form of weakness that needed to be purged through absolute dedication to destruction as an end in itself. Their post-heresy tactics abandoned any pretense of strategic objectives in favor of siege warfare that prioritized the infliction of maximum suffering over tactical effectiveness. The Daemon engines and warp-touch siege technologies, developed during their service to Chaos, incorporated principles that had been first tested during the Iron Cage engagement. These innovations demonstrated that the mathematical precision that had once made them the galaxy's premier siege specialists could be perverted into tools for systematic torture that transcended physical limitations and entered the realm of psychological warfare that attacked the fundamental assumptions underlying Imperial military culture. Iron Warriors warbands throughout the Eye of Terror began implementing siege techniques that were specifically designed to exploit the psychological conditioning that had been developed in response to the Iron Cage. They understood better than any other Chaos force how to turn Imperial defensive instincts against themselves, creating siege situations that forced loyalist forces to choose between tactical withdrawal and systematic self-destruction. The influence of Iron Warriors' tactical innovation spread beyond Chaos Space Marines to affect all branches of Chaos military forces. Traitor Guard regiments began implementing siege doctrines that prioritized the corruption of enemy morale over tactical victory. Chaos cults throughout the Imperium adopted fortress-breaking techniques that were designed to demonstrate the futility of Imperial defensive thinking rather than achieve strategic objectives. The psychological warfare methods developed by the Iron Warriors proved particularly effective against Imperial forces that had been trained according to post-Iron Cage doctrine. The conditioning that was designed to prevent Imperial forces from becoming vulnerable to extremist manipulation actually made them more susceptible to tactics that exploited their fear of appearing insufficiently loyal or dedicated to their duties. The most disturbing legacy may be that the Iron Cage taught both sides that sometimes the greatest victory comes from proving you're willing to destroy everything you're supposed to protect. The broader implications of the Iron Cage extended beyond military doctrine to affect Imperial culture at the most fundamental levels. The concept of honorable sacrifice that had been demonstrated at Sebastus IV became a template for how Imperial citizens were expected to respond to impossible situations. Rather than seeking tactical solutions that might preserve Imperial resources while achieving strategic objectives, Imperial authorities began treating systematic self-destruction as evidence of moral superiority. This cultural shift affected everything from planetary defense strategies to individual combat doctrine. Imperial Guard regiments were trained to view tactical withdrawal as evidence of corruption, even when retreat would preserve forces for more effective deployment elsewhere. PDF forces were conditioned to implement last stand protocols that prioritized symbolic resistance over practical defensive effectiveness. The influence extended beyond military forces to affect civilian populations throughout the Imperium. Imperial citizens were taught to view survival in the face of overwhelming odds as evidence of insufficient dedication to Imperial ideals. The concept of acceptable casualties was expanded to include entire planetary populations that could be sacrificed to prove the superiority of imperial values over practical concerns. The ecclesiarchy incorporated the Iron Cage into imperial religious doctrine as evidence that true faith required the willingness to embrace systematic destruction, rather than compromise with enemies of humanity. The theological implications of this interpretation created a religious framework that treated tactical failure as spiritual success, provided that failure was achieved through sufficient demonstration of fanatical dedication. The Adeptus Mechanicus developed technological doctrines that prioritize theoretical purity over practical effectiveness, creating weapons and defensive systems that were designed to demonstrate the superiority of imperial engineering principles rather than achieve tactical objectives. The mathematical models that had been developed during the Iron Cage became templates for calculating optimal resource expenditure in terms of symbolic value rather than strategic effectiveness. The long-term psychological impact on Space Marine culture proved even more significant than the immediate tactical consequences. Successor chapters throughout the Imperium began developing variations of Iron Cage doctrine that emphasized different aspects of the systematic self-destruction that had been demonstrated at Sebastus IV. Some focused on defensive martyrdom, others on analytical precision pushed to self-destructive extremes, but all incorporated elements of the philosophical framework that treated tactical failure as evidence of moral superiority. The training protocols developed for new Space Marine recruits incorporated psychological conditioning, designed to eliminate the kind of independent thinking that might prevent them from implementing obviously suicidal tactics when ordered to do so by their superiors. The selection criteria for Space Marine candidates were modified to identify individuals who showed the psychological profile that would enable them to function effectively while participating in systematic self-destruction. The command structures of Space Marine chapters were modified to include institutional mechanisms that would ensure compliance with suicidal orders while preventing the kind of rational tactical analysis that might interfere with doctrinal demonstration. Officers who showed signs of prioritizing practical effectiveness over theoretical purity were identified as security risks that required elimination or extensive psychological reconditioning. The Iron Cage had established a precedent that would influence imperial military culture for 10 millennia, creating institutional frameworks that treated systematic self-destruction as the ultimate expression of loyalty to imperial ideals. This legacy would prove both enduring and catastrophic, as generation after generation of imperial forces learned to measure their success not by their achievements, but by their willingness to embrace destruction for abstract principles that serve no practical purpose beyond the demonstration of ideological purity. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, as the Imperium faces existential threats that dwarf even the Horus Heresy, the lessons of the Iron Cage remain as relevant and terrifying as they were 10,000 years ago. Recent archaeological expeditions to Sebastus IV have uncovered evidence that suggests the true scope of what transpired during those nightmare months may have been far worse than even the classified imperial records indicate. What they have discovered challenges not just our understanding of that ancient tragedy, but our assumptions about the fundamental nature of Space Marine psychology and the stability of imperial military doctrine. The excavations conducted by Magos archaeologist Vexus Theta 7 have revealed technological artifacts that incorporate principles unknown to current imperial science. These devices appear to be psychological conditioning apparatus that could modify Space Marine neural patterns in real time, creating the kind of systematic behavioral modification that would have been necessary to transform rational warriors into willing participants in their own destruction. The implications are staggering. The Iron Cage may have been not just a military engagement, but a field test for technologies that could turn any imperial force into a suicide cult through technological rather than psychological manipulation. Recent discoveries suggest that the Iron Cage may not be finished, that the mutual destruction was only the first phase of something far more terrible. The most disturbing discovery has been the uncovering of sealed chambers beneath the Iron Cage's central citadel that contain what appear to be stasis pods designed to preserve specimens for extended periods. Imperial dating techniques suggest that these chambers were activated during the final phase of the Iron Cage engagement, but their contents remain sealed behind technologies that resist all attempts at analysis. The working theory among Imperial archaeologists is that both Primarchs may have preserved samples of their legion's psychological conditioning for future use. Intelligence reports from across the galaxy have documented a disturbing pattern of military units developing Iron Cage-like symptoms without any apparent external cause. Imperial Guard regiments that show no signs of chaos corruption begin implementing tactical doctrines that prioritize casualty maximization over strategic effectiveness. Space Marine chapters that have never been exposed to Iron Cage doctrine suddenly develop training protocols that eliminate survival instincts in favor of absolute obedience to suicidal orders. The pattern suggests that the psychological virus that consumed the Iron Warriors and Imperial Fists may be spreading through Imperial military culture through mechanisms that are not yet understood. Some Imperial scholars theorize that the conditioning techniques developed during the Iron Cage have become embedded in Imperial military doctrine at such fundamental levels that they are being transmitted unconsciously through routine training and indoctrination procedures. The Iron Warriors' continued use of siege warfare tactics that specifically target Imperial psychological conditioning provides additional evidence that the Iron Cage established precedents that continue to influence current conflicts. Chaos forces throughout the galaxy have begun implementing siege techniques that are designed not to achieve tactical victory, but to force Imperial defenders to choose between tactical withdrawal and systematic self-destruction. Recent encounters between Imperial Fist successor chapters and Iron Warriors warbands have revealed that both sides continue to treat these engagements as continuations of the Iron Cage rather than routine military operations. The tactical innovations implemented during these encounters prioritize doctrinal demonstration over practical effectiveness, creating casualties that serve no strategic purpose beyond proving the superiority of competing philosophical frameworks. The most troubling development has been the discovery that these encounters are being deliberately orchestrated by unknown parties who seem to possess detailed knowledge of both sides' psychological conditioning. Intelligence analysis suggests that some external force may be manipulating both Imperial and Chaos forces to recreate Iron Cage conditions on a smaller scale throughout the galaxy. The implications are both hopeful and terrifying. If the Iron Cage proved that Space Marines can destroy themselves for abstract principles, what does that mean for the Imperium's future when faced with even greater threats? The return of Primarch Robot Guilliman to active leadership has provided new perspective on the Iron Cage's continuing influence on Imperial military culture. Guilliman's assessment of current Space Marine doctrine has identified numerous tactical innovations that can be traced directly to Iron Cage precedents, creating systematic vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit to turn Imperial forces against themselves. The Primarchs' attempts to reform Imperial military doctrine to eliminate these vulnerabilities have encountered resistance from institutions that have been shaped by 10 millennia of Iron Cage-influenced thinking. Many Space Marine chapters view Guilliman's emphasis on tactical flexibility and survival-oriented strategy as evidence of corruption that threatens the purity of Imperial military doctrine. The theological implications of the Iron Cage continue to influence Imperial religious doctrine in ways that may be undermining the Imperium's ability to respond effectively to current threats. The Ecclesiarchy's interpretation of systematic self-destruction as evidence of superior faith has created cultural expectations that prevent Imperial forces from implementing tactical innovations that might improve their effectiveness, but contradict established precedents for acceptable sacrifice. The Adeptus Mechanicus has begun investigating the possibility that the technologies discovered at Sebastus IV may be related to archaeotech artifacts found throughout the galaxy that seem designed to modify human psychology on a massive scale. The working theory is that the Iron Cage may have been part of a larger pattern of psychological warfare that extends back to the Dark Age of technology. The most significant modern implication of the Iron Cage may be its relevance to the current strategic situation facing the Imperium. The galaxy-spanning threats posed by the Tyranid hive fleets, Chaos incursions, and Xenos invasions require tactical flexibility and innovative thinking that may be incompatible with the psychological conditioning that has been shaped by Iron Cage precedents. The question that haunts Imperial strategists is whether the Imperium's military forces have been so thoroughly conditioned by Iron Cage doctrine that they are incapable of adapting to threats that require genuine tactical innovation rather than systematic self-destruction. The preliminary evidence suggests that many Imperial forces may prefer familiar patterns of heroic failure over unfamiliar strategies that might achieve actual success. The Iron Cage has become more than a historical event. It has become a psychological template that shapes how Imperial forces understand the relationship between loyalty and effectiveness. This template may be preventing the Imperium from developing the kind of adaptive military culture that would be necessary to survive the challenges of the current millennium. The archaeological evidence suggests that both Dorn and Perturabo may have understood that their Iron Cage engagement was being monitored and analyzed by parties whose identity and objectives remain unknown. The technological sophistication of the monitoring equipment discovered at Sebastus IV exceeds current Imperial capabilities, suggesting that the Iron Cage may have been observed by forces that possessed knowledge about Space Marine psychology that exceeded even Primarch-level understanding. The possibility that the Iron Cage was deliberately orchestrated by unknown parties for purposes that remain unclear has profound implications for current Imperial strategy. If the systematic self-destruction of two premier legions was part of a larger plan, then the continuing influence of Iron Cage doctrine throughout Imperial military culture may be serving objectives that are antithetical to Imperial interests. The final and most terrifying implication is that the Iron Cage may have established precedents that are preparing Imperial forces for some future scenario, where systematic self-destruction will be required on a galactic scale. The psychological conditioning that enables Imperial forces to embrace certain death for abstract principles may be intended to facilitate some ultimate sacrifice that will determine the fate of humanity itself. In the grim darkness of the far future, the Iron Cage stands as the ultimate proof that in a galaxy where there is only war, sometimes the greatest enemy is the reflection in the mirror. The Iron Warriors and Imperial Fists taught the Imperium a lesson it has never forgotten: that loyalty and honor, pushed to their absolute limits, become indistinguishable from madness. And in the dying light of the 41st millennium, as the Imperium faces threats that dwarf even the Horus Heresy, the question remains: when the next Iron Cage appears, will humanity's defenders choose survival, or will they once again choose the terrible honor of mutual annihilation? The answer may determine whether the Imperium has a future at all, or whether the psychological virus that consumed two of the Emperor's greatest legions will finally achieve its ultimate purpose: the systematic destruction of everything that humanity has built among the stars. The Iron Cage was not just a battle between rival military doctrines, but a glimpse into the abyss that awaits any civilization that allows its virtues to be weaponized against itself. In a universe where there is only war, the greatest victory may belong to those who recognize that sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to play the game that your enemies have designed for your destruction.